Klockan är 9:00 och
It's now 9 o'clock and the chamber is in session. The party leaders debate. And the debating rules. In the first round, the Prime Minister and the leader of the Moderate Party are entitled to a speech of no more than 7 minutes, and the other party leaders are entitled to a speech of no more than 5 minutes. These speeches are to be given from the rostrum, and there will be no rejoinders in that first round. Then we'll have a second round where all participants are entitled to speak for no more than 2 minutes, and here we have a free right of reply, and we're going to have those rejoinders relative to party size, and we'll be using the dual link method with no more than 4 minutes per dual. And the rejoinders we will have from the rostrum in front of the podium. And we will begin with the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, Social Democratic Party.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, in 6 months from now, we're entering into a new decade. The 20th of the last century were decisive. Sweden took its first stumbling steps in democracy, but with extreme differences between people. Per Albin Hansson, the Prime Minister, pointed out that there's formal equality in terms of political rights, but socially the class society remains firmly in place. We've enjoyed 100 years of democracy now. Many people who are sitting around today in an old farm or in a working class home, living lives that our grandparents couldn't even dream of if they had tried to imagine it. This is something that any Swede who's involved in society has every reason to be proud of. But, Mr. Speaker, socially we still have a class-based society. At the end of the day, it's up to this chamber to determine whether the new 20th will be one step in the backwards direction or another step towards equality. Should the class society auxiliary nurse feel anxiety over the retirement old age pension and seeing that other people make 358,000 kroner per year. Should a country-based craftsman feel worried about the lack of resources for GPs and primary care facilities and paying mortgage interest rates to large commercial banks with huge profits every year? Should a talented but poor girl follow how her former classmates enter into Oxford and Harvard, knowing that the local upper secondary school might be closed down if there's a lack of profits for the school company? Today's class society is not identical to that of 100 years ago, but snus is snus nevertheless, moist snuff. Lack of justice and equality remains the same, even if it's packaged differently. And we need to respond the same way we did back then in Sweden. These huge differences and injustices need to be done away with. All children in Sweden should have the same point of departure. All the sons and daughters of this country must be given the opportunity to not just provide for themselves but also and their families, but also to enjoy everything that makes life humanly rich in well-being. And there's one main solution to this problem: greater social justice and equality by nationwide efforts to strive towards the ideal of a home for all without favoritism and stepchildren, building a society which isn't satisfied to see that 150,000 people more have a job now, but to make sure that everyone can come back to their beloved ones at the end of the day and say, yes, I got this job, and then proudly go to work in a way which lays the basis, the foundation for our welfare society. We use a well-managed economy in the best way possible to have well-kept primary care centres, well-manned police stations, and more welcoming care facilities for the elderly. A stronger society, which means that anyone who's organising a local pub event or a cafe at an annual meeting of an NGO who's active locally can feel the support of the nation. In one. It's not going to be a simple task. It's going to require very tough prioritization, close cooperation with all the municipalities and regions of this country, including those who are governed by our my fiercest political opponents. But this is part of what we need to achieve, what we want to achieve. Take the climate transition, for example. It can only be managed with popular support if it's also led by the principles of social justice. Gang crime, almost every day we see the cruelties on a daily basis virtually, with bombings and shootings, and we will bring them in one after the other. 5 times more are placed under remand, and we are taking this fight. Crime can only be rooted up by ensuring that the police are strong and can cooperate with the social services and other government agencies so that they are unable to recruit more people into criminality. We will take steps into the future. We will have not stronger migration but integration, and the demands are high. We need to ensure that there's a possibility to work, to learn Swedish, to become part of our society, and equal opportunities, vocational training, language proficiency, equal terms and conditions of life. We give priority to welfare. It's not an easy task, but this is the task which the party I'm in charge of is ready to shoulder. The whole point, the whole idea, the reason for negotiations, for compromise, to keep at it, to try and work to construct a strong society with the power to provide an equal footing with equal opportunities and comforts, whether you live in a rural or urban area, in a suburb or elsewhere, characterized by respect and understanding between human beings. And if people are reluctant to say whether this is possible, remember that it took a country with hunger-based riots and memories of mass emigration, and we turned it into a welfare state. And surely one of the wealthiest and most developed countries in the world should be able to pool its resources once again and ensure that we can live in as much equality, freedom, solidarity as it takes to astound the rest of the world. Because, Mr. Speaker, we celebrate 100 years of democracy. But socially speaking, this class society is still very much in place. Our role remains to ensure that all the sons and daughters of this country can enjoy everything that is good and makes life worth living as human beings.
Tack. Ordet för anförande går.
Thank you, and we will continue with Ulf Kristersson from the Moderate Party.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, you can actually paint a pretty bright picture of Sweden. We have successful companies. Ericsson has just built the first commercial 5G network in Europe, and Spotify has revolutionized the music business. And there are more IKEA stores across the world than we have Swedish embassies. And we're now out doing the Norwegians in the sprint relays. And we had a good start against Chile yesterday in the World Cup. And you can also paint a much gloomier picture. You can talk about the integration crisis, gang criminality, explosions, shootings. Unemployment among immigrants is 4 times as high as among those who are born in the country. We have children who do not speak Swedish very well and grown-ups who do not speak Swedish at all. So we have that growing marginalization, and now we have the energy shortage on top of that. Mr. Speaker, the government has lost control over what's happening in Sweden. We have big problems that remain unsolved, and it's obvious that the government has no well-thought-through idea or political plan. A few examples. 306 shootings last year, basically one a day, 43 people killed, almost one a week. According to the Crime Prevention Council, we have more sexual abuse, tripled since 2014, and they're not being investigated. Last Sunday, we saw an explosion attack with an apartment block being destroyed in Linköping. A wonder that no one was killed. And explosions in this last night as well, and a young guy being killed in Malmö. So more and more gang criminality. And the Social Democrats have promised to deal with this with more police officers, more stringent punishments to keep criminals away from the streets. But that was before the elections. Now things are deteriorating, but the government has decided to cut the budget for the police with 250 million. And we know that Stefan Löfven will say that we're working on expanding the police academy, but we have no recruits, so it doesn't help. You do not get proper payment for that training, and we cannot just talk away the gang criminality. We also have Swedish companies who can't grow because they do not have electricity, as if Sweden were a country with energy rations and no basic infrastructure. Stefan Löfven, during several election campaigns, has promised to do more for Swedish trade and industry with more innovation, business plans for Sweden so that we would have the lowest unemployment in Europe. But this came to be a big fiasco. And energy policy is another fiasco. We know that the basis for Swedish energy supplies is nuclear power and hydropower. And most of us know that Stefan Löfven really wants to keep nuclear power, but he can't say that because the Green Party wants to do away with nuclear. And now we also have more and more companies saying that they have an energy shortage. We see big projects being stopped in Stockholm, Göteborg and Malmö. We see the company Lindab moving activities from Sweden. They say that we can't have production in a country where we can't guarantee energy supply. Socialism usually leads to two things: a shortage of energy and a shortage of bread. And that is what we see with the bakery Pågen in Malmö. No energy and no new bakery. And, Mr. Speaker, we have the Swedish armed forces to guarantee our freedom, but all other parties understand that we need stronger defense. The Social Democrats, however, they do not want to talk about it. And we have the Defense Commission White Book that suffered a breakdown, but that doesn't have to be the case for the Swedish armed forces. But we have a budget. We have a budget that guarantees money, but now the Social Democrats want to save, and they want to save on defense. So they say that there are other things that we have to allow to cost money, like taking a leap year, for example. And now we also have the biggest issue of our time, immigration, the immigration crisis. Well, that is something we're suffering from because we haven't had a proper policy for several years. And if we are to manage the integration of these hundreds, thousands of people who have already come here, we need to have a proper immigration policy. But the government next week in this chamber will want to make decisions about a more generous immigration policy to open the doors for more relatives to immigrants who are already here, which means that we'll have even more immigrants coming to Sweden. It will become more difficult with integration, and it will devaluate the entire migration policy and its plausibility. And this is reckless, and it's not taking your responsibility. And the Social Democrats actually promised to do that. They promised us before the election a more stringent immigration policy, but that is not what they're doing today. And Sweden does have many problems. One of them is about leadership. We have a prime minister who says that he's going to deal with the problems, but instead he just allows them to grow and get bigger. I am optimistic, however, because we have dealt with the difficult problems before in Sweden, and we've also been able to use big opportunities before. That was how we once built the successful Swedish model. However, it's not functional. It has to be rebuilt. And then we need to focus on what is important: integration, crime, defense, and we also have to give companies an opportunity to grow. Because, well, for everyone who sees problems and understands problems and wants to solve problems, for everyone who does that, well, the moderate, that is the alternative in Swedish policies, the Swedish Moderate Party. Thank you.
Tack.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jimmy Åkesson of the Sweden Democrats for his address.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the first parliamentary year of this term of office has almost come to an end, and it is a historic first year where the election outcome of the main government party was historically poor, and the formation of government took an historically long period and was, historically speaking, also more complicated than ever before. There were letdowns of historic consequences in the discussions to form a new government, and we saw shameless, virtually epic bad behavior from many of those involved. The new political landscape was shaped as a result, is also unparalleled, mainly partly because the defining characteristic is not left to right anymore to the same extent, and also because the 100-year hegemony of the Social Democrats has been turned into dust. We see a social democratic government implementing a virtually neoliberal reform agenda, which the previous right-wing government didn't even want to get involved with. The social democratic movement and their friends spent the entire election campaign scaring their electorate about this. But when it was time to grab power, they found it quite easy to accept. This is unparalleled, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the behaviour we've witnessed. And in the wake of this, welfare is being eroded. I saw that the Prime Minister give his equivalent to the address a long time ago on the value of creating an equal situation for all in Sweden, the Folkham address. Now we're witnessing a situation where one municipality after the other are releasing alarmist reports of big problems at municipalities. Every third or fourth municipality had a deficit last year. One contributing factor is the fact that the contributions are no longer paid, the allocations are no longer paid for refugees and immigrants, and now they have no jobs and nowhere to live. No accommodation. The previous approach by the government that we stand to gain from mass immigration has been has been shown to be unfounded. When are the profits going to come in? You owe us an answer, Mr. Prime Minister. For the past 10 years, mental ill health amongst children between the ages of 10 and 17 has doubled. In the group of young adults, the increase is to the tune of 70%. The social democratic response to this challenge is to cut back on psychiatric services to the tune of 90 million kroner. How does that cutback help all those young people who need assistance and help here and now? Stefan Löfven owes us an answer to that question as well. Sweden has more old-age pensioners living in poverty of all the Nordic countries and more than a majority of the EU member states. We are, what we're doing is hitting our elderly people hard. When will the government and Stefan Löfven ever understand that a decent society is mainly focused on giving the country's own citizens and residents a decent situation before you throw billions to the citizens of other countries? Stefan Löfven owes us an answer. Mr. Speaker, we do not build walls, Stefan Löfven told us, but that is precisely what is happening, in fact. Closing people in, shutting them into a shadow existence, into poverty and despair, frustration, social exclusion. And now, in addition, they're pushing forward with political measures which will open up for even higher levels of asylum-related immigration. And it is so reckless in its lack of responsibility that it defies believing. When is it going to be enough for the government and the left-wing liberal majority? Mr. Speaker, Stefan Löfven owes us an answer. Thank you.
Tack. Ordet för anförande går nu.
Thank you. The next speaker is Annie Lööf, the Centre Party. You have the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the next few years are of decisive importance for whether we are going to manage one of the greatest challenges facing humanity, because the climate challenge cannot wait and the environmental problems must be ignored. Recently, the highest ever concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 3 million years was measured. We see young people, an entire generation, who tell us, do not destroy our future. We see how climate change is very tangible for very many people, for the whole world. Just ask all the farmers who last year saw their harvest wither away, or the forest owners who saw their forests being devoured by the flames, or people with their own well who saw water levels fall and their wells run dry. In parts of the country, the situation is worse this year than last year. We cannot ignore this any longer. We must take the alarm signal seriously. Mr. Speaker, we need to take responsibility. We need to act. Because while some of people in this chamber are busy trying to reduce and deny the problems, we in the Centre Party are busy trying to find solutions. In the European elections only 3 weeks ago, we had our best result ever. More people than ever before in a European election chose to vote for the Centre Party, and many did so because we chose to put our political focus on the climate and the environment. We presented a number of new concrete proposals in the field of the environment and climate. We want to make it easy for people to choose the train rather than flying, and we want to facilitate the conversion to greener air transport, both within Europe and the rest of the world. We also want to stimulate and encourage new green environmental technology, both solutions reduce emissions and that actually remove emissions from the atmosphere. Our environmental responsibility is for real. Our climate policy is needed, both in Europe and in Sweden. And I'm happy that so many people saw our struggle for the climate and placed their confidence in us on the 26th of May. Mr. Speaker, the countryside plays a key role for green conversion. If we are going to manage the climate and a unified society, this conversion has to take place in a sustainable and fair manner. The green sectors must be given the right conditions. We must use the raw material from the forest and use the potential of the forests. For the Centre Party, the conditions for the countryside is an obvious priority. So we welcome that more parties recently have chosen to commit themselves to countryside and agricultural issues. During the spring, several movements who want to see better conditions for the countryside have raised their voices. Only a few days ago, there was a debate here at our initiative in Parliament about the conditions for the countryside, and we listened to the hundreds of thousands of people who raised their voices, people who just want to be able to stay there, to run their businesses and have fair conditions. We know that our policy makes a difference. All those of us who grew up in the countryside and who felt a sense of belonging and enterprise that permeates villages and communities know the force that is there. If you only given the chance, without stifling bureaucracy and politicians who can't leave well alone, that force needs to be supported. We can meet the climate threat, we can reduce the environmental problems, we can use the countryside as a conversion key, and we can build a Sweden that is held together. Thank you.
Ordet för anförande går till Jonas Sjöstedt.
Jonas Sjöstedt of the Left Party is the next speaker for his address.
Tack så mycket, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, my congratulations to the Swedish Women's World Cup team for an excellent victory last night. I hope that the day will come when we will see women football players playing on equal terms financially as well, when they perform so well to represent our country. A while back, we saw major demonstrations and manifestations in the streets that didn't gain a lot of attention, not a lot of mention in news articles and on TV, but there were thousands, preschool teachers and teachers in particular, and they sounded the alarm for the difficulties encountered by many municipalities, a difficult situation with too many children per group, with risks of further deteriorations. Resources are being taken away when, in fact, we need more resources and support. We need to listen carefully to their message and pay attention, because when teachers and preschool teachers are no longer able to spend time with the children who truly need support, we know that we have difficulties. We also know that the same alarm bells can be heard from those who work in elderly care services. They struggle to keep up with panic type cutbacks in healthcare. We've seen it in many of our regions. Municipalities raise taxes at a level not seen in years. And many do it due to deficits in the finances. We see cutbacks to the welfare in this country, in various parts of the country, and it's directly linked to decisions made in this chamber by this parliament, this Riksdag. This is the effect, the impact of the decisions made here. We all know that that the welfare sector had needed lots of new contributions, tens of millions, to guarantee the current level. And in addition, we need to see new investments. The government should have refocused their policies by now, so that it's time to hold off with major tax cuts. Let's make the investments and provide the contributions necessary to provide decent conditions for nurses, teachers and preschool teachers, and etc. Why, if you ask government, they tell us that it's because of the brown blue budget adopted previously. They chose from those parties to do away with some of the equality reforms that we had ensured from the left party. The millions to teachers disappeared. The budget was adopted in here, and it had negative consequences for the welfare system in Sweden, regardless of what Mr. Åkesson and Kristersson are saying from the podium. But there was an opportunity in the spring to table amendments to give full priority to the welfare sector, but they chose not to do this. The government is busy implementing the election manifesto of the Centre Party and the Liberal Party, with tax cuts for those who make the most money in our society. Now they intend to continue. They're raising the grant levels for the home repair and improvement services. They're changing tax rules for the highest income earners, and in Danderyd, a right-wing municipality, they sold out a lot of the public goods, and now they are forced to resorting to raising taxes instead. That's simply the way things are right now. The government intends to continue this, and the auxiliary nurses, the preschool teachers and the teachers and the children and our elderly will have to pick up the tab for the price this is going to involve for all of us. They will carry the cost, but it is possible to raise income to the welfare sector. For anyone with a higher wealth income and capital income, we can raise taxes. It's perfectly feasible to implement welfare and justice reforms, enabling people to go to the dentist when needed, that we can provide for those who've worked hard for a long time. But it's impossible with the policies of the government today. The government is very much the ones responsible for the crisis that we see in the municipality. There are those who are proud of the tax cuts, especially for the highest income earners. But it's like wielding an axe against children, preschool teachers and teachers. It's not to be interpreted too literally, however. Let me just point that out, the wielding of the axe. The left-wing party acted correctly in trying to ensure the right government. We will never support this. We're proud to support the actual formation of government, but we will not accept any deteriorations of the Security of Employment Act and the market-based rents. We will never accept. We need to try and ensure equal opportunities. It's not enough to pay lip service in beautiful speeches. You need to have the right policies to ensure that you achieve your goals. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tack. Ordet för anförande går till...
Thank you. The next speaker is Eva Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, let me start on a lighter note and say that I believe all the parties in the Swedish Parliament can agree about something. It will be nice to have a summer holiday. It's a strange parliamentary year that we're now putting behind us. Last year's election campaign was intense, but the aftermath was both longer and more trying than the election campaign itself. Months of negotiations and discussions followed, and there were many of us who smiled when the parliamentary cafeteria started offering a buffet of cookies and biscuits and cakes that was sold under the name of negotiations with the Speaker. Since then, we've had yet another election campaign that degenerated into fireworks of distortions and insults, and I don't think that it strengthened the confidence in politicians among the Swedish people. Now real policies have to be at the center of what we do. And we're in a hurry, because even if Parliament takes a summer break, the healthcare crisis doesn't. It gets worse. The summer is the time when women who are about to give birth run the greatest risk of not being given a place in a delivery ward, when health service staff are asked to interrupt their holiday to come back to work. And it's also the time when the long queues get even longer. Last year, another 46,000 people were added to the queues, about as many as the audience attracted to the Friends Arena when Beyoncé was there, my favourite and the Prime Minister's favourite. Mr. Speaker, still, it's only the Christian Democrats who realise that the Swedish healthcare services need to be completely reconstructed, that the county councils are too small and too weak to give and provide care that is good, equal and timely. The Swedish Parliament, after a proposal from the Christian Democrats and the moderates, have decided about another 4 billion kronor to strengthen the health service. Another 1.6 billion to a revised and updated Q billion, 1.5 billion to enhance primary care, 500 million to an updated national cancer plan and 400 million to paid training for specialist nurses. But the strange thing, Mr. Speaker, is that out of these 4 billion, not a single krona has been paid, although 183 days have elapsed. The calm that patients and staff should be allowed to experience has instead settled on the government offices. And something similar can be said about the situation for the people who are dependent of aid according to the law on support and services to people with certain disabilities. The government would have needed to act swiftly to change the law and guarantee the right to help with breeding and tube feeding. And they would have needed to act swiftly when children who have lost their right to assistance instead ended up in institutions. But the only thing they did swiftly was to kick out the Director General of the National Insurance Office, Ann-Marie Begler. She became the scapegoat of government policy when the Social Democratic leadership needed to save themselves. That, Mr. Speaker, is shameful and it's not worthy of Sweden and Swedish politics. Putting together a country's budget to use people's and companies' tax money in a good way is not easy. We know that as Christian Democrats. We've been in a government. We know that good priorities require good values, that you can choose the important above what's fun, to be able to say no to those who have strong voices and instead consider those who have no voices. Mr. Speaker, the government managed to stay in office, but it didn't manage the art of combining priorities and values, and the results are obvious in Swedish welfare, and the Christian Democrats will continue to talk about this. We will not let go of health care for the elderly and the assistance to people with disabilities, nor will we let go of crime, this paralysing toxin that most recently affected Linköping and Malmö. In the face of such threats, the state needs to act firmly. In the face of such forces, politics need to act more forcefully. Otherwise, honest Sweden, safe Sweden and trusting Sweden will lose the battle. This is the basis of our view of society as Christian Democrats. We offer safety and security and welfare to those who need the support of society and unconditional struggle against those who violate the laws of society. When we go for a summer break now, we should remember that all social problems do not take a summer break. Thank you.
I thank you, and we will continue with Jan Björklund from the Liberal Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, 25 years ago, I became a real politician. That was when I became a city commissioner for the city of Stockholm. At that time, we had a deep, severe financial crisis in Sweden, but we also had a lot of optimism. We believed in the future, and that was because the Berlin Wall had been torn down just a few years before then. I was a young captain at a cavalry regiment, Svea Livgarde, and we followed the developments in the Soviet Union. But the socialist tyrannies in the East, they had no confidence amongst their own citizens anymore. People wanted the liberal freedom of the West, and the liberal revolution 30 years ago came to be a peaceful one. The fall of the Berlin Wall also led to a global development era across the globe, with market economy, democratization of many countries in the third world, did away with the tariffs, and we had trade and openness. We talked about, maybe we didn't talk about globalization, but that was what we meant. And the world became freer, better, and walls were torn down. Since then, well, we've seen the best time of humanity. People have never had lives that have been as good as during these 30 years. The financial growth has been as strong as it was during the 30,000 previous years. The average lifespan is higher, infant mortality is lower, and fewer people are illiterate. So how to explain that so many people in the West now seem to want to turn away from that world order that has been so successful? The most important leaders of the Western world, they do not want to lead the Western world anymore, just their own country, and they want to build walls to protect against neighbors. 10 years ago, we had two very severe crises, the financial crisis, the most severe crisis in 80 years, and that created mass unemployment in many parts of the world. And we also saw the breakdown of the Middle East that led to a refugee crisis and a terrorist threat. And that means, well, that there was a great deal of concern and fear that has been used by those who want to do away with our societies, that want to redo the societal model. And we have to admit that the Western world hasn't been able to meet and solve these crises. We haven't done that well enough and fast enough. And that is the main task for our country and for the other countries in the Western world. We need to solve these problems, and we need to have more of a collaboration to prevent future crises of a similar nature. But we also need to look at what's positive. We have to remember that we had a financial crisis also during the 30s, and that led to dictatorships, world war, and that did not happen this time. And I do think that that collective memory of the 1930s is there, and that is why we have been vigilant. But we also have today strong institutions that were built after the world wars. We have the EU, NATO, and the United Nations, and they have also helped to manage the situation. We have to ensure that these institutions are not weakened. We have to learn from history. It's openness that creates success, not being closed as a country. But if we collaborate, we become successful. We do not become successful by working against each other. What makes us successful is building bridges, not building walls. Mr. Speaker, this is the 39th party leaders debate that I participate in this chamber. And I've been a party leader for 12 years. I've been a politician for 25 years. And it's been great fun most of the time. But it is very demanding. To be elected by the Swedish people to become part of the parliament, that is a great benefit. To be allowed to participate in the development of our society, that is a great benefit. And I'm very, very proud and touched of having been given this confidence. And I want to say thank you to everyone in parliament and government, party leaders, speakers, and also everyone at home, all citizens. Thank you.
Tack.
Thank you. The next speaker is Per Bolund, the Green Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd also like to thank Jan Björklund for his inspiration over the many years that I've been able to follow him. So thank you for that. We listen That was what the CEO of the British Organisation for Coal and Oil said. And the person she was going to listen to was Greta Thunberg. To listen has become an emergency exit for those who have no answers. To listen has become an excuse for not doing anything. Just imagine that if you ask your kids to clean their rooms, how many of you will be happy with the answer, yes, Dad, I'm listening? To those of us who work with environmental issues for many years, there is another version that we recognize. We consider the environment. How many times have we heard that? We also consider the environment, actually. But how could you do the same thing in other areas of policy? Who can get away with saying, we consider unemployment, we consider crime? This shows one thing very clearly. When it comes to the most important issue of our age, that the time has come to going from listening to doing something. It's time for a new alliance in Swedish politics, an alliance for the climate. And we see now how a new popular movement is emerging. And we can already see the effects of this movement. The airplane tax that was initiated by the Green Party has raised an important discussion in society, which means that flying is falling in frequency now, and people choose to take the train instead. 328,000 fewer passengers travel from Swedish airports during the first quarter of this year compared with the previous year. And at the same time, train bookings have increased by 10% in only 1 year. The sales of electric cars have increased by 440% in May this year compared with the month of May last year. And that's, of course, due to the bonus-malus system that the Green Party has been involved in introducing. Electricity-powered cars, including hybrids, ethanol and gas, now today account for approximately 20% of all registrations of new cars. The sales of solar cells are breaking records in Sweden, and IKEA will now, for the first time, start selling solar panels in Sweden because they realize that the market is growing. Within Swedish wind energy, the government's policy has now led to that wind power will have doubled by the year 2022, and then a quarter of all electricity that we use will come from wind power. Swedish consumers now choose not to eat red meat for climate reasons, and vegetarian food is increasing very rapidly. We see that the engagement and commitment is on the increase, on the rapid increase in our country. And we have the knowledge, we have the technology, and we have the resources. So the question is, do we have the will to do something? Together, we can now launch a joint project where we, together with enterprises, with agriculture and companies, create a country that is fossil-free. And the January agreement lays the basis for such a new alliance in Swedish politics. We have the opportunity to make life easier for people, to make climate-smart choices by investing in train traffic all over the country, in fast trains and night trains to the continent, by ensuring that those who adorn their roofs with solar panels can get support for this, and that those who undergo conversion to climate-friendly production will get support for that. In the near future, all new cars in Sweden will be run by renewables and electricity, and we want as many roofs as possible to be covered with solar panels in our country. The EU, the European election showed that environmental policy is something that the electorate wants, and so the parties are growing. We have children today who are afraid of their future, and it's our duty to replace that fear with hope, and hope is something we get through action. And for that reason, we need a new alliance for the climate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tack.
And thank you. We're now going to continue with the second round of this debate, where every speaker will be entitled to no more than 2 minutes of speaking time. And we will begin the second round with the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, please.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, I can agree with many of the things that have been said in the first round. I'll not include in that most of the negative things that have been said about the government, but well, what we've heard from the right-wing parties about welfare, I have to say that if we are to think about a dividing line in Swedish policy, then we also have to remember the last budget proposal made by the right-wing parties, where they wanted to spend less on schools, for example. Remember this last fall, when they wanted to spend 20 billion on tax deductions and pay nothing for welfare. Also remember that the reform that the government will present, the tax reform, might have tax reductions, but the overall purpose is to ensure that we have a long-term financing of Swedish welfare, the Swedish welfare system and equality. The moderate party tax reform would not just give most to those who already have the most, but they also want to finance it with what they talk about as an ambitious reform, cutting in grants. And that will mean, in plain language, to pay less for welfare. So, Ulf Kristersson, when you come up here again, please tell us more about all those cuts you want to make in the Swedish welfare system.
Tack.
Thank you. And Ulf Kristersson from the Moderate Party, Jimmy Åkesson, Sweden Democrats, and the Center Party, Jonas Sjöstedt, Left Party, Ebba Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats have asked for rejoinders. And we will begin with Ulf Kristersson.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday was a perfectly normal day in Sweden, but not in Malmö. Just after 10, a man acted strangely in Malmö Central Station, and the police had to shoot him in both legs. And later in the evening, 2 men acted violently. And then at 3:15 in the morning, there was a new bomb, this time outside a nightclub in the middle of town, in the center of the town. An ordinary Monday, and a perfectly normal day in Sweden, in Malmö. But this mustn't be a part of our daily life. How serious will it get before the government decides to do something about the situation?
Tack. Statsministern.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I do think that we pretty much are in agreement as to, well, the fact that we need to deal with criminality, not the least gang criminality. That is not where we have the dividing line, but let me try to refresh your memory. We add more resources to the police than they asked for themselves. We have twice as many police recruits being trained compared to when you, Ulf Kristersson, were in government. And it's not true that we haven't had enough applications for the next training opportunity to become a police officer. So the situation is improving, and the conditions for the police officers are improving as well. We'll make it easier for them to have camera surveillance, and we're making punishments more stringent for many different crimes.
Mr. Speaker, I don't doubt that there's goodwill on the part of the Prime Minister, but I doubt his ability. I don't doubt that you want to remove criminality, but you can't, because you don't do the right thing. There are fewer police officers today than in 2014. You shook your head then. There were 20,051 in 2014. There are just over 19,000 today. Fewer police officers, more severe crimes, more sex crimes, shootings almost every day. You've lost control over the probably most important question that people ask themselves: can I feel safe in my hometown? Is there anyone who protects me at night? You've failed in the most fundamental area of government policy. Do something, don't just talk.
Statsministern.
Prime Minister. Well, let me repeat. The police authority see that increase in police officers because we train twice as many, but they have to be trained. They are not there waiting. When you were in government, Ulf Kristersson, then you could wear a gun in your pocket. You could be apprehended by the police. You were brought to the police station, but then you were released. And there wasn't much of a punishment. But things are different today. If you wear a gun, a weapon in town today, and if you're apprehended, you will be imprisoned for 2 years as a minimum. And that is what we are doing. And that is why we have criminals going to jail. And that is why the prisons are full. And why we now have to buy bunk beds, because the prisons are full. And we're going to continue. We need to remove criminality from our streets.
Thank you. So the series of rejoinder was finished, and I now give the floor to Jimmy Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats. Mr. Speaker, Stefan Löfven wants to talk about welfare, so I'm going to oblige him. There are many nice speeches, not least by the Prime Minister. But nice speeches and fine words aren't enough. You have to look at reality as well. And we can stand here at the rostrum and say that we are going to prioritize this and that, and we are going to build up Sweden and the welfare system again. But what Stefan Löfven and his government has done since they took office 5 years ago is absolutely to the contrary. They've continued to disassemble the welfare system, to throw away the Swedish welfare model. And they've done this for mainly one reason, namely that they have given priority to immigration of asylum seekers and their relatives. Stefan Löfven, how does this all go together?
Tack talman.
Well, thank you. Not often have I given applause before I've actually spoken. Well, welfare. That is exactly what we're focusing on. And we do that in 2 ways. One, we ensure that we have more people in employment, 250,000 more people in employment. That is the foundation. And we're also ensuring that we have resources for our welfare system. That is what we have done while in government. We have invested more during our term in government compared to what has been done for decades. And we have 100,000 of those new jobs in the welfare sector, hospitals, care of the elderly. And that is what we need to continue doing, because I don't think that we've done enough yet. But we cannot do what the moderate party is talking about with tax reductions and believe that that will lead to increase of welfare. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. And the Sweden Democrats are over there in the corner to the right, and that is not a great success for the welfare system.
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Mr. Speaker, if we reduce taxes in the right way, it will increase tax revenue. I'm not sure that removing the increased tax for high-income earners is the best way to improve the welfare system, but Stefan Löfven seems to believe that. Nor do I doubt that your ambitions are good, Mr. Löfven, but there is a lack of understanding or perhaps a lack of will to realize what reality really looks like. The Swedish population has increased dramatically in recent years due to an immigration policy that is totally irresponsible. And this is the reason why the municipalities are struggling today despite the good financial situation. So how are you going to reconcile continued strong immigration with a strong welfare system. It just doesn't work.
Prime Minister, well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The big difference is that if we reduce tax revenue to the extent that you're proposing, we'll have less money for welfare. What we're doing with the January agreement, well, if I had had a free choice, I wouldn't have removed that additional tax on high-income earners. But now we have an agreement, and it's about ensuring that we'll long-term have a proper welfare system. Immigration policy, we have actually changed. That is what we have done during our term in government. We have fewer individuals coming to Sweden today. And if there had been a majority in this chamber, I would also look at immigration for work in Sweden. I do not think that we need to bring in people from abroad when we have people here in Sweden who can do the job. I do not have children, but I do understand that if you do have children, you do want to have reunification. That's the human thing to do. I do understand those immigrants.
And that brings us to the end of that series of rejoinders, and Annie Lööf now has the floor. Mr. Speaker, before the election in 2014, there was an agreement between 6 parties about the future of the independent schools. The Green Party and the Social Democrats decided to leave that agreement by running amok to struggle against independent schools during the previous government period. We managed to save the independent schools, and the Reepalu inquiry was thrown away. But residue from this struggle against independent schools is that these schools should have to report on their finances as a part of the principle of public access. But despite the fact that the general agreement shows another direction for independent schools, the Prime Minister takes a positive look at this. So I'm asking you, are you going to present this as a motion to Parliament about public access to the records of private companies?
Well, thank you. This is something that we're looking into. We're now looking at what needs to be done. And we are in agreement about the independent schools, just what you talked about and how to manage that. But nevertheless, we need to understand that there is a problem. Everything is not just fine. For example, we now have in Swedish schools a problem where everyone is just thinking about grades. And we have pupils, students being fooled because the schools are competing in good grades. And that is a problem. That's a problem we have in Swedish schools. And we're dividing pupils into too many different types of schools, which is not good for Swedish society. And this is something that we need to deal with. And when it comes to religious free schools, I think we are in agreement. And if I had had a majority in Parliament, I would have had a total ban on religious independent schools. But we do need to see and understand where we have the real problems.
Annie Lööf.
Herr talman, och nu tillbaka då till...
Annie Lööf. Well, let me get back to the issue of the right of public access to private enterprise records, because what we have to relate this to is the January agreement, and it says that this should be of crucial importance for the Swedish welfare model. And to me and most other people, it's obvious that it's important to have good conditions for schools, both private and public schools. It should be equal for all, and there should be proper inspection. But to introduce the right of public access to the records of one type of companies that work with public funds is a way of undermining private industry and business. So my question is, should the same principle of public access apply also to construction companies that use public funds in their work? And how is private enterprise being safeguarded then?
Well, thank you. Let's stick with schools. And I do think that we should have that discussion about the fact that we pay tax for schools to ensure that our children are given the best possible education. And then we also need to discuss how to use that money. Is that unreasonable? No, I do not think so. We need to discuss that. We also need to discuss how you can choose between schools, and that system is not perfect. Sometimes you need to put your child in a line for a school as soon as the child has been born. And we do have problems. We have problems with Swedish schools. We see improved results, but bigger challenges still remain, and we need to discuss that freedom of choice and also the right to start schools, but we need to focus on the children and to use taxpayers' money in the best possible way.
Tack. Därmed var det replikskiftet.
Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinder. Jonas Sjöstedt of the Left Party has the next rejoinder.
Herr talman,
Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister Löfven. In his introductory remarks, the Prime Minister mentioned the auxiliary nurses worried about getting a low old age pension. There's every reason for them to be worried if you look at the levels, and many of them are not even able to work until the retirement age due to health issues. Now you're proposing a raising of the retirement age even for them. Many of them will be in danger of having to access their retirement pension ahead of time with a much lower compensation. We've proposed simplified rules so that if you are in that situation, you can receive illness compensation until the age of 67, and then keeping some of your old age retirement money until you actually retire. But there is no such proposal now, and so the members of the Swedish TUC, Confederation, trade unions are in danger of being the worst affected. What do you intend to do about this?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do think that one of the most important things we can do is to ensure that people actually can work until retirement. And you can't trick someone and say that you can work fewer years and still get your pension. But that would be tricking, fooling people, because the pension is based on for how long you work. And we see many people being burned out today, not least women working in the healthcare sector. And that is why we have to ensure that we have proper resources, that we have enough people working in hospitals and in welfare, so that we have enough people, so that people do not have to suffer from burnout syndrome. And that is what we need to do. If you say that we do not need to do anything, well, that is not correct, because we cannot just get pensions without working, and we need to ensure that we have enough money to pay proper pensions for everyone. But the first step is to ensure that you can work until normal retirement age.
Jonas Sjöstedt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's excellent if more people are able to and want to work until an older age. I think we will see a development along those lines, but we know that for hundreds of thousands of people, they're not able to keep up. Auxiliary nurses, construction workers, shift workers, they're simply not able. Their bodies refuse, they're not able to do it, and they are in danger of being the big losers when we raise the retirement age, unless we do something to protect those who've laboured very hard in their jobs for decades. We need proposals where construction workers and auxiliary nurses who are unable to stay in the labour market receive a decent old age pension when they retire. And as far as I can tell, there's absolutely nothing. There's a void in the proposals from the government for this group. They are in danger of being the big losers when there's a raising of the retirement age. That mustn't happen.
Well, thank you. A lot is actually being done for Swedish pensioners. Last mandate period, we increased pensions with on average 100,000 krona. Now the basic pension is to be increased as well. And that will help, for example, assistant nurses. And we're also going to look at those who have worked an entire working life, but maybe worked part-time. They need to have an increase as well. And we also want to ensure that we have more payments being made to the pension system. That is what we need to do. There is no quick fix. We need to bring in more money for the pension system so that we can guarantee all wage earners at least 70% of that wage as a pension. That is what we need to do. But we also need to look at all those women working in the healthcare sector. We have to ensure that their bodies do not say no, that they can work until old age.
That concludes this round of rejoinders, and the next rejoinder is for Ebba Busch Thor of the Christian Democratic Party. You have the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, with all the new solutions to welfare issues, there's a three-phase familiar one: preventing, making it more difficult, and delaying things. The million kroner to reduce some of the waiting lines, for example. You have done all of those three things when it was time to reintroduce it. And the same for investments in primary health care. The decision adopted back in December. In total, 4 billion kroner to health care in the moderate party Christian Democratic budget, still not used. The money is there, but the patients are kept on hold. Staff are working themselves completely to exhaustion, and during the summer this is only going to get worse. And now I'd like an answer from the Prime Minister. What do you do every day, and where is the money?
Tack, statsministern.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Social Democrats, has one answer, I guess the Christian Democrats also has one answer or suggestion as to what to do. You want to carry out tax reductions, but that will not help. We have a proposal, and we're not going to be too hasty. We need to avoid previous mistakes that have been made. We had the so-called Q billion, and that worked for those who were chronically ill, perhaps, but it just gave you a premium if you had many more visits to doctors. And then it was said from the Doctors Association that we need to look at real needs, and we are now doing this properly. We are going to present a proposal to have a reform of the primary healthcare sector, and we also are going to look at how to have money to do away with waiting times. But we need to have a proper system, and we will present a proper proposal.
Ebba Busch Thor.
Thank you, Ebba Busch Thor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and myself will get significant tax reductions next year. That's what we see with the government of the Social Democrats. But with the proposal of the Christian Democrats and the Moderate Party, everyone will see a reduction of taxes with an investment of an additional 400 million, which for 183 days, not a week or so, this government has held off on. When I mentioned this in the previous party leaders debate, the website crashed. The number of patients who are waiting illegally long periods is at a higher number than ever, and that's before the summer months. So I ask you once again, what is the reason why this government has held off 183 days to get some of the most marginalized people in society, those who are sick, having access to what they need, good, equal care when they need it? The money doesn't benefit in the barn kept by the Finance Minister, Magdalena Andersson.
Tack, statsministern.
Prime Minister. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work that is now being done will mean that we will soon have a proposal. You will soon see our proposal on how to spend another billion on doing away with waiting times for healthcare. And we have been discussing this, for example, with the county councils, and we need to ensure that we do not make the mistake of the right-wing parties where we just give a premium for those who go to the doctor all the time. We need to look at proper needs, and that is what we're doing now. The Christian Democrats did not do it, but we are doing this. We're working on this, and we're doing that together with the providers of healthcare, and we need to do away with those waiting times for healthcare. You should have access to it when you need it, and we will very soon present a proposal.
Tack. Därmed var...
Thank you. That concludes this rejoinder with the Prime Minister. Now give the floor to Ulf Kristersson of the Moderate Party for his second address.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, electricity supply is under jeopardy. Many alarm bells are going off. There are warns of lack of energy, which can impact the infrastructure investments around Stockholm. The bakery Pågen would like to expand their operations in Malmö, but are not able to do so because of lack of energy. Anders Karlsson Jandal, the CEO, says that power shortage is something you only hear about in developing countries. And the company Lindab has been told the same thing and relocated some of their activities to Denmark and Germany as a result. The risk of energy shortage is a reality for several parts of Sweden, Uppsala, Gothenburg, Stockholm, and there are also potential threats to the hospitals in the Skåne region to the south. Mr. Speaker, crisis can come suddenly, but this was an active one created by the current government in a three-stage period. First, they increased the cost by 8 times, shutting down some of the facilities, and then secondly, a new proposal for a regulation on the power companies, which reduced the opportunity for necessary investments in power grid investments. And then Ringhals 1 and 2 nuclear power plants being shut down, and a large part of the clean energy is disappearing. Anders Ygeman just waves his hand and says, we don't have a shortage of power. And Katarina Luhr of the Green Party says that this is only for the very coldest days when people turn on their coffee bots or want to take a shower. This is just not acceptable. 184 mandates in here are demanding, requiring the government to present a better proposal. We want a better energy policy to safeguard our society and the companies. The responsibility lies very firmly and heavily on the 100 mandates of the Social Democratic Party.
Thank you. And the following have asked for rejoinders: Stefan Löfven, Social Democrats, Nilöv Centre Party, and Per Bolund from the Green Party. But we'll start with the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There wasn't much that was true or said here. We have a broad energy agreement that includes the Moderate Party, and I hope that you'll stand up to your promises. You've also talked about how to fight crime, and we do agree that that needs to be done. The police, however, needs proper tools. You, while in government, didn't train enough police officers, but we are shouldering that responsibility. And yesterday we submitted to the Chamber a proposal also about harsher punishments. What you never say anything about is how to do away with that foundation, what leads people into crime and criminality. We have to ensure that people have jobs, that we have an equal, better school, that we have leisure time activities that are available, etc. And when, Ulf Kristersson, will we hear you talk about that, the root causes of crime?
Mr. Speaker, well, we don't want more. It's not getting more facilities and places to go to for our youth in their leisure time is not going to resolve the matter of crime. When young children and young adults are forced into this sort of behaviour, we need to lock up those who tempt them and lure them into this. We have proposals, you've said no to them, but if we double the penalties for people involved in gang criminality, they'll disappear off the street. They can no longer attract 12 and 13-year-olds. If they learn something in school and get good grades when they finish compulsory school, their chances will improve dramatically. Prevention has to be for real, not just a softball approach. If you don't put a halt to serious criminality, people will lose the confidence in the Swedish welfare and legal system. That would be a disaster for Sweden.
Prime Minister, well, it is obvious that we need to do two things. One is exactly what Ulf Kristersson talked about, and that is why we have more people in prison today than we've had for a long time, and that is why we're now buying bunk beds to have beds for everyone in prison. But the problem is that we have others who are marginalized in the suburbs, and I am now willing to shoulder the responsibility. We need to stop the supply of young individuals becoming criminals. These young people have to see their parents with a job. They have to have a school they can go to, and they have to be able to get proper jobs. They also have to have good areas to live in, and they need to have leisure time activities. That actually is important. And when will the moderate party start to talk about the root causes of crime and how to stop that supply of young people ending up being criminals?
Mr. Christensen. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right. It takes two things, and you're not doing any of those two. You're not putting a stop to those involved in serious crime and who last night and yesterday and the day before shoot at each other, scare the life out of people, could have injured lots of people. You don't have time to deal with them. If you'd been satisfied with the results so far, then surely it would be even more appalling. It's worse now than when you took up office. We have fewer police officers than when you came into power, and you're doing nothing for prevention either. We're not succeeding with the children in our schools. In suburbs, schools are of lower quality. Clearly, people are walking around recruiting new young people into criminality. So the Prime Minister is right. It takes two different types of efforts. Very harsh response to serious crime, lock people away where necessary, and good preventive, preemptive action. And you fail on both accounts.
Thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we will continue with Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ulf Kristersson, I think I've seen the last week or so more energy in the Moderate Party. You have been talking a lot in government about rules and the insurance office, public insurance office, and you've seemed to be interested in many things. But there is one thing that I think is wanting in this new commitment and energy in the Moderate Party, and that is that none from the Moderate Party has mentioned the real scandal, which is that we have thousands of people who do not get their sick pay, that they cannot work because their bodies say no, or they're burned out and they're not entitled to any compensation. So how come you're not talking about that real scandal that we see with people not getting that sick pay?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me say that I appreciate that the leader of the left-wing party is so involved and interested in the life and energy levels of the Moderate Party. I'm going to convey that message to everyone who's been working here. But I think Jonas Sjöstedt has missed a point. Their involvement in the lack of management by the government of a government agency is to do with what you're allowed to do with heads of independent government agencies from the government. We've had lots of discussion here in this chamber about this, and we've had a very critical assessment coming out of the Committee on the Constitution. I also spent a number of years of my life focusing on ensuring that we now have a healthcare insurance which can support people when they are unwell, when they fall ill, but who will not keep them at home longer than is absolutely necessary. That discussion is of equal necessity, and I'm happy to take that debate any day.
Jonas Sjöstedt.
Thank you, Jonas Sjöstedt. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. That is true, that there is reason to criticize the government, and we've also done that. And we've also done that when the manager of the Public Insurance Office was fired. But we also see in the moderate rhetorics now a new type of language, because you were the one who started with Reinfeldt as a prime minister to go after those who need to be on sick leave. And you have worsened the system we have, because we now have an end date as to when you cannot get money from the public health insurance anymore. We should give protection for those who are ill, but that is not what you have been doing. You have been working against that security, and perhaps you should put more of your energy in that area.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, that's not the case at all. Nor were we the first to point out the huge problem to society with lots of people being on sick leave. That was Göran Persson, and he was right. He coined the expression of reducing something by half. We have twice the sickness absence levels that we should be able to expect in a country, a welfare state. He never succeeded, but the way he diagnosed the problem was correct. You have to get people into the labour market to get the tax revenues required to allow people who are sick to receive compensation when they are at home and unable to work. Then you can't have a sickness insurance where lots of people who would have been able to work and still year after year they remain on sick leave. That was the problem that the government of Göran Persson identified. We saw it too, but the problem, or rather the difference, was that we managed to do something about it as opposed to Göran Persson's government. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders, and the next rejoinder is for Per Bolund of the Green Party. You have the floor.
Ja, tack fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think it's brave of Ulf Kristersson to stand here and present arguments for more nuclear power at the same time as he wants to reduce allowances to other forms of energy, renewable energy. But I want to ask you another question. When we as parents come home tonight, we look forward to giving our children a hug. Sometimes we're late and it's not very nice. But just imagine not seeing your children in 1, 2 or 5 years. You won't be able to go to school to see them. You won't be able to hug them goodnight. And in this chamber, there are two parties that would want to make it possible for parents to reunite with their children. And my question to Ulf Kristersson is, why don't you want to give other parents in Sweden the opportunity to hug their children goodnight every night?
Ulf Kristersson. Thank you. Let's begin with coal power. We're not increasing emissions because you dismantled local power production. You did that. Another 50,000 tons would be emitted due to the dismantling of parts of the CHP generation in Stockholm, combined heat and power. This is madness, complete madness in fact. You're dismantling the stable sources of energy that we have and that could contribute to long-lasting electrification of Sweden, of our industries, our road transports, what could be a true alliance for a long-standing, lasting policy is now being dismantled, and you're importing with a short-term solution of dirty electricity. When it comes to children, our approach is that Sweden needs a strict migration policy for it to be able to cope with the huge challenge of integration we're faced with for the next year. Several 100,000 people have arrived into this country. If we get back to the rules which were in place before 2015 and increase even more, we'll have serious problems.
Thank you, Per Bolund, the Green Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The distinguishing line between the Green Party and the moderates is very clear here. We are making an effort to dismantle coal-powered energy in Sweden. That's responsible policy. And we see what's happening. Wind power and solar energy is increasing in Sweden. We are about to get a 100% renewable energy system, but the moderates are trying to delay this conversion. When it comes to family reunification, it is difficult with the moderates' attitude because it's so clear that you are also acting against the interest of integration. How can you as a parent concentrate on getting a job and trying to find a stable basis for your family if I constantly have to worry about my wife and my children and their welfare? That's not a reasonable policy for Sweden. We have to create the possibilities for families to be together. That's only then can you really try to be integrated in Swedish society.
Ulf Kristersson. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think it's perfectly obvious that Sweden today is unable to return to more liberal, more generous rules for compensation and rules generally on immigration than the rest of Europe. I think everyone can understand why. We took in such a large number of people and we have huge integration-related problems. If we create a lack of certainty generally on the Swedish migration policies in the future, we're going to do a disservice to this country, making it more difficult for the people who have already come to this country to integrate themselves. And I think that you're jeopardizing something very, very serious indeed if you go back to a more sloppy immigration policy in this country. Thank you. That concludes all rounds of rejoinders for Mr. Ulf Kristersson. And now Mr. Jimmy Åkesson for his second address.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, Stefan Löfven gave his first address and talked about the home for all Swedes. So let us talk about that. I claim, Madam Speaker, that Stefan Löfven and the Social Democrats, they speak many fine words, but they don't understand what the Sweden for all Swedes is about. Stefan Löfven quotes Per Albin Hansson, but, Madam Speaker, he doesn't understand Per Albin Hansson. I dare say that it's no coincidence that a social system that we called a home for all Swedes was created in Sweden because we had the prerequisites for doing that. The prerequisites for such a social model are called a sense of belonging, a sense of community, trust, a sense of duty, feeling at home, a spirit of citizenship, inner solidarity, etc., etc. And Madam Speaker, all these aspects are something that social democracy have worked to tear down for decades, to remove gradually. They tear down this popular home and they destroy the foundations for this social model. In order to recreate a modern home for Swedes, for a popular home, we need to increase trust in the spirit of citizenship. We need to increase internal solidarity. Do your duty, demand your rights, and when in Rome, do as the Romans do. These are simple and self-evident things, but they are very basic and very important for society to be held together. If you give priority to the immigration of asylum seekers and relations, well, then you have to do as we do in Sweden or decide to go to another country.
Rejoinders requested from Stefan Löfven, Ulf Kristersson, Annie Lööf, Jonas Sjöstedt and Per Bolund. Prime Minister Stefan Löfven first.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, Jimmy Åkesson, don't even try with Per Albin Hansson, former Prime Minister. You're as far away as you could possibly get. A party that says that Jews cannot be Swedes at the same time, or Samis cannot be Swedes. Don't even try to make any parallels with Per Albin Hansson. Just leave it. Your right-wing grouping includes the Moderate Party and the Christian Democrats. You voted in favour of their budget proposals. You're prepared to help elect moderate local councillors. There have been questions about the cooperation, but that you side with the Moderate Party is not something we even have to ask about. But it's a good way of declaring the content of your politics in open. We've seen how you've played the role you've played over the past 8 years, attacking the terms and conditions of wage earners. I wonder what the Sweden Democrats are like so much about the 8 year of welfare attacks by the Moderate Party. And what is it you see ahead that attracts you so much and appeals to you?
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't know if it's possible for Stefan Löfven to give a single address to this assembly without lying. Just for the sake of having said this, I want to emphasize that the Sweden Democrats stand up both for the rights both of the Sami and the Jewish minority to affirm and develop their respective cultural legacies. That's what we stand for. What Stefan Löfven says is that these groups should be assimilated. That's not our policy. These are groups that should be allowed to exist as minorities in Sweden. That's all we say. When it comes to the policies of the moderate party, well, I'm not a moderate myself. I'm a Sweden Democrat. I'm the chairperson of the Sweden Democratic Party. And sometimes our policies coincide with those of the moderate party, for example, when it comes to certain taxes. But I'm not going to stand here and defend the policies of the moderates. They have to do that themselves.
Prime Minister Stefan Löfven. No, shouldering the responsibility that befalls you is not something that appears to appeal to you. Seeing you voted in favour of a budget that removes huge resources from the welfare sector. I'm responsible, on the other hand, for ensuring that we have a compromise which will, in fact, include some components of potential tax reductions, but we're responsible and shoulder the responsibility to reduce the growing gaps in society, providing wage earners the chance for vocational training if they need to transition into another profession or another industry, and making sure that all children are entitled to good schooling wherever they come from, and that youth facilities are available for young people whose families are unable to travel abroad on holidays. Regular, ordinary people are not going around, Jimmy Åkesson, waiting for the cutbacks of the Conservative Moderate Party. Why do you wait around for it?
Thank you, Mr. Åkesson. Well, Madam Speaker, let us continue to talk about welfare. Stefan Löfven has been the Prime Minister for 5 of these parliamentary years and has managed to double the queues in the health service, so the system. He's managed to continue with the catastrophic educational policy, and his primary goal during the first 4 years was that we should have the lowest unemployment level in the European Union. We're so far removed from that target now, much further than we were at the beginning of his period in office. So it's easy to speak fine words and it's easy to say how things should be, but the fact is that Stefan Löfven and the Social Democratic government has not managed to succeed with anything of what they said they were going to do. That's the fact, Madam Speaker, and I'm very happy that we do what we can do in order to get another policy and another budget than the one supported by Stefan Löfven.
Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders. Now the next rejoinder, Ulf Kristersson of the Moderate Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, there was significant agreement on the need for strengthening of the Swedish defence. It was a strength for Sweden to find that everyone agreed. However, there was a lack of agreement on how this was to be financed. There was definite turbulence and uncertainty in the 11th hour caused by the Social Democrats, where they suddenly raised question marks about how to finance this. The Liberal Party, the Moderate Party, etc., refused to accept this sort of play and have wish lists with no financial cover in terms of a budget. I was a bit surprised why you supported the perspective of the Social Democrats and the left when it comes to military issues and defence.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Speaking of charades, this is what we saw when the previous alliance parties very dramatically chose to skip this. Because there are two things here. One is the contents and the direction of the policy. We're agreed there. There is one party, namely the Sweden Democrats, that throughout the years have argued in favour of stronger defence and stronger defence capacity. But I'm also happy that at least the moderates have adopted this policy in comparison with the period where the moderates felt that this was a special interest. And then the question of finances. And you can choose different solutions for that. You can choose medially interesting forms like they did, or you could conclude that the economic conditions for the Swedish armed forces are a part of the budget. And I'd be happy to discuss this with Stefan Löfven in the future.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, as I said, I don't doubt that you would like to strengthen the armed forces of this country. I think everyone is in favour of that. That's an asset to our nation. We are all in agreement on the need to strengthen the armed forces, but you can't just wish for it unless you're also prepared to fund it. You can have long lists of saying we are going to do precisely this over the next few years. This is what we want the armed forces to prepare themselves for. But whether or not we have money to do this, well, that we have no idea. So it was unfortunate to table a document outlining in detail what the armed forces were expected to do, but leaving the matter of funding out of the picture. So I was surprised to see that the Sweden Democrats, who would like to see a strengthening of the armed forces, can accept such an approach.
Final rejoinder from Jimmy Åkesson. Well, it's really surprising that Ulf Kristersson continues to play this game. The Sweden Democrats is the party that has allocated the greatest amount of money to the defense budget. And as I said, Madam Speaker, I'm happy to discuss this with Ulf Kristersson and other party leaders in this assembly so that the Swedish armed forces can get the resources they need to build up our defense capacity. But this question is much more complicated than that. I'd like to see a stronger Swedish defense. We're fortunately in agreement about this. So adopt our view, then the armed forces will get more money than before because we allocate more money than any other party. So just come to me and the military will get more money.
Next round of rejoinder with Annie Lööf of the Centre Party. You have the floor.
Fru talman, Sverigedemokraterna
Madam Speaker, the Sweden Democrats have not become known as major climate and environmental supporters. We remember how climate was in quotation marks in one of your budgets, but I was surprised when I read one of your reservations in the defense context. We see that there's absolutely no doubt that human activity has marginally increased the degree of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and also said that exactly how the increased rates of carbon dioxide will impact global climate we know is something we know very little about, because there are a number of other factors, more or less known, which controls the climate. That's, to put it mildly, a gross underestimation of everything that researchers have told us. If you deny the climate threat enough, it'll go away. That appears to be the Sweden Democratic approach. So I ask Jimmy Åkesson, does the Sweden Democrats feel that human activity only marginally contributed to increasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere?
Jimmy Åkesson, Sweden Democrats. Madam Speaker, yes, there is climate change. There's no doubt about it. And that human activity has affected such change. There is no doubt about that either. I'm not the right person to say to what extent human activity has affected this. Then the scientists have to, that's for the scientists to decide. It doesn't matter to me because we are still pursuing a policy for improved climate. That's the interesting thing here, not the analysis, but what policies do you pursue? And when other parties, not least within the left liberal alliances within this assembly, when they pursue an incredibly national-centered policy for the climate, then we argue for a policy that is global and that makes a real difference for the emission that would most likely affect the climate globally. That's the most important thing for us. We're not interested in the money that we get, but the effect that we get.
Annie Lööf, Centre Party. Yes. Well, I can answer on your behalf. Recently, the highest carbon dioxide rates measured ever in 3 million years in the atmosphere was measured recently since in the start of the industrialized era. The carbon dioxide has gone up by 42%. That's not a marginal increase. It's an enormous increase. And it takes cooperation, where EU cooperation is very important. You've shifted positions so that you can rule and divide from the inside. If we want to cope with the climate threat nationally and internationally, we're going to need more cooperation. However, and I get back to this, recently the climate was expressed within brackets in your own budget. You see the situation in the defense cooperation setup where you're writing about how it's only a marginal increase. It's not something that's happened by accident. This is the approach that your politicians have taken. Is Jimmy Åkesson of the opinion that it's reasonable that you have two approaches? You're standing here on the one hand trying to defend your policies, and over again you keep arguing in a way that denies climate change.
Fru talman,
Thank you. Final rejoinder to Jimmy Åkesson. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think the last quote from Annie Lööf is very clear. There is no climate denial in this. We point to the fact that human activity is behind the climate change that we see. Then the extent to which this is happening, it's not up to me to decide. But it's not important when it comes to what climate policy we are going to pursue, whether we are going to continue with the road that we've chosen so far, with various ways to make life difficult for people in the countryside who lives outside of Stockholm, or whether we are going to change the policy so that we can pursue a globally efficient climate policy without the Swedish countryside suffering from it. That's the difference between me and Annie Lööf and the rest of the Left Liberal Alliance in the Swedish Parliament.
That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we will continue with Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Jimmy Åkesson. The Swedish Democrats have ensured that the budget of the moderates and the Christian parties got a majority, and that will have a big impact on Swedish society. It'll focus on lowering taxes for those who make the most, and the reforms that we, the Left Party, managed to bring about during the previous government are now being removed. And one thing that we had succeeded in, but that will never be completed, is that we wanted 2 billion to be spent on having more people working in the healthcare sector, more people working in homes for the elderly, more time for the elderly. That is what our proposal would have led to. Also, that it would be easier to switch from part-time to full-time. And how come, Jimmy Åkesson, how come the Sweden Democrats wants to discontinue those investments in the healthcare sector?
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Madam Speaker, let me just remind you and Jonas Sjöstedt and the rest of the Swedish Parliament that it was Jonas Sjöstedt who ensured that the Sweden Social Democrats and Stefan Löfven came back into office. A government that is now reducing taxes for the richest by getting rid of the increased tax for high-income earners. So I think you're throwing stones in a glass house. And it's not the case, and Jonas Sjöstedt knows that a budget doesn't work so that you can pick and choose. I insist that the budget that was taken last autumn was much better than the one that was presented by the government. But we presented our own budget as Sweden Democrats, which contained very large investments in the elderly, lowered taxes, increased guarantee pensions, but also improvements in pensions.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Jimmy Åkesson is a full-time skilled politician, but he refuses to take responsibility for what he's done. You pressed the button in favor of this budget, so the 2 billion for the old age care that was needed, dearly needed for those who are working there, those who need the services, those 2 billion disappeared, and this is because of you, the Sweden Democrats. It's your responsibility, and you have no reply. You just talk about, other pretend budgets that no one wanted, and no one wanted to vote for our pretend budget, but what you're saying is not good enough. I voted in favor of having a better tax profile, and I will continue doing that. I will continue to vote against that right-wing policy, but you, the Sweden Democrats, bear the responsibility for these cuts for the Swedish healthcare sector.
Thank you. Final rejoinder from Jimmy Åkesson. Without getting excited like Jonas Sjöstedt did, I just conclude that Jonas Sjöstedt is responsible for the present policy, which means that we're getting rid of increased taxes for high-income earners and market-related rents. Per Bolund now has the floor.
Tack, fru talman. Jag skulle vilja prata med...
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to talk to Jimmy Åkesson about words that are chosen or not chosen. You have a party comrade, Teddy Nilsson, who is now the chair of a municipal board, and he thinks it's appropriate to talk about Annie Lööf here in this chamber as someone who is committing treason against the country, and he wants to ban the pride flag. And then you say that these are just things he's written. That doesn't hurt anyone. And do you really think that this is true? And do you think that his words are well chosen?
Mr. Åkesson. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think all politicians at one time or another use words that they may regret later on. I think that applies to Per Bolund and probably everyone here if you have any sort of display any form of self-criticism. I think that applies to Teddy Nilsson in Svalöv as well. I'm not aware of everything he has said over the years as a politician, but what I find is that when it comes to the claim that he wants to prohibit the pride banner, that's not true. It's a question of whether the local councils should use the pride flag or other political symbols on their municipal flagpole. That's what he was against. I don't think that's unreasonable. There are many other local councils in Sweden who believe this. It's a good thing. I have no problems with the pride banner, but perhaps not as a part of the municipal's official attitude.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. This is something that Jimmy Åkesson says a lot, that everyone commits a mistake once in a while. But there is one party that stands out. You have these careless, racist opinions and things that create a lot of tension in our society. That is the Sweden Democrats doing that, and you have to take that responsibility. But I also want to ask you a question about something that Annie Lööf talked about, the climate. They've had elections in Denmark, and your sister party, the party there, didn't do all that well. Evidently their strategy didn't work, and the founder of that party, Pia Kjaersgaard, explained why. She said that it was because of the climate lunatics, and also said that it's better for the environment if I fly more. And I want to ask you, are those words well chosen?
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Madam Speaker, it was a very long link of association here. Primarily, we can conclude that people's engagement for the environment is on the increase, both in Sweden and in Denmark. We also find that there's a decrease in support for the Green Party. I wonder why that is. Could it be that the climate environmental policy of the Green Party has nothing to do with reality, that your policy makes ordinary people suffer, that it's a policy for the elite in large cities who do not understand the conditions for ordinary people in rural areas? Because and so you make the life much more difficult for people in those areas because you simply don't understand what you're doing. Could it be that that's why you're doing so badly in the Green Party? Madam Speaker, I think this is certainly the case.
That concludes all those rejoinders. And before the next speaker, I would like to say welcome to... No? Yes? Yes, we have someone up there. Before the next speaker, I would like to welcome the Speaker of Armenia with his delegation. Welcome to the chamber.
President of the National Assembly of the Republic of Armenia, His Excellency Mr. Ararat Mirzoyan and his delegation, and wish them a warm welcome to the gallery and to the Swedish Parliament. Welcome.
And then it's time for the next speaker, and that's Annie Lööf from the Centre Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, it's now 100 years since we got universal suffrage in Sweden. 100 years where men and women have had the same opportunities to make an impact. That was a big change back then, but it's something that's self-evident today. For most of us, but not for everyone. We are in 2019, but women's rights are not as given as men's rights, not even today, and we need to continue to work for equal rights. And that means that we need to work hard with words and deeds. We need to strive towards self-determination for women, for their own bodies, and so that they can make their own decisions. And what we see today is devastating. More than 1 of 3 young women being victims of sexual crimes, and many calls to the emergency centers talking about these problems every day. And these women, they do not want to have words. They want concrete action. We need to spend money on this. We need to ensure that children can have a summer break without seeing the mother being abused. And we need to focus on that safety of women. We need to spend more resources on increased equality across the country, and we need to spend more money on emergency shelters, women's shelters. And we need to continue to fight honor-related crime. We're going to spend another 45 million on that and another 45 million on fighting crime in close relationships. And we're doing that to improve the support for those women and children who are subject to violence, and also to ensure that women will not have to fear rape. And we need to ensure that we have a more equal Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you. Jimmy Åkesson, Sweden Democrats, Jonas Sjöstedt, the Left Party, and Eva Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats have requested rejoinders. And the first speaker is Jimmy Åkesson. You have the floor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Annie Lööf often mentions rural areas and the conditions for the countryside in her speeches and in different debates, and that's a good thing. I Googled yesterday a little bit, and my search words were Annie Lööf and tax on petrol. And I found some statements. Annie Lööf held a summer speech in August 2014, and she said the following: if the Social Democrats win the election, taxes on tourism and petrol will be increased dramatically. In 2016, she said, no increased petrol tax. Now, Madam Speaker, she contributes, together with her party, to making sure that the Left Liberal Alliance in the Swedish Parliament can increase the tax on petrol, and that we will have a petrol price that has never been as high as before. Are you happy with that?
Thank you. That is not correct. The budget for this year is a budget from the moderate party, Christian Democratic Party, and the Sweden Democrats have supported that, which means that we have 2 indices for petrol tax. One is still applying, and then we have one on pause. And that increase in tax on diesel, for example, that we have this year, that is something that goes back to December. But the spring budget that we voted for, there we have no tax increases. What we're talking about now, and what is being debated across the country, is the tax increases of Jimmy Åkesson. We want to ensure that there is no extra burden for those living in the countryside. We will continue to be the voice of the countryside, of the rural areas. We think it's important to lower taxes for those individuals living there, and that is why our budget proposal had those tax reductions.
Talman.
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, Annie Lööf is the chairperson of the Centre Party. The Centre Party is a part of the Left Liberal Alliance in the Swedish Parliament, which forms the basis for the Social Democratic government, and they have very clearly stated that they aim to reintroduce the over-indexation of the petrol price. Should I interpret you, Annie Lööf, as not being prepared to let such a budget through?
Well, Madam Speaker, this is no secret that we're against that over-indexation. We have been against that for many years, but we need to stick to facts. And what is interesting is action. Now we have an increase in the petrol tax that has been done through automatic means, and that is because of the budget that the Sweden Democrats voted for in December, and that is where we have that normal increase due to the index. And this is something that is a result of what the Sweden Democrats did in this chamber. The Centre Party has not participated in making decisions to increase petrol tax.
Thank you. That was the last rejoinder, and the next speaker is Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, Annie Lööf, the Centre Party is present in more local governments in Sweden than any other party, and Centre Party members all over Sweden are now presenting the coming budgets, and it's cuts to care for the elderly, cuts to schools, etc. Centre Party municipalities like Mora, Kristinehamn, Kungälv, Tjörn and others make drastic cuts, above all in the field of education. This means less support for children who need support. It means larger classes, and this is a direct effect of the national policy and the fact that the Centre Party allows the tax decreases in the budget remain and that you don't allocate money to the welfare system. What is your message, Annie Lööf, to teachers and preschool teachers whose conditions are now being impaired thanks to this policy?
Annie Lööf, well, it is true that we are there ruling certain municipalities and regions, and what we're trying to do is to safeguard welfare system across the country, but we have not voted through that government budget yet. It is being dealt with, and it will be debated in this chamber this fall. The financial policy that we've seen the last 4 years, that is the policy of the left, and that is what we see being implemented in municipalities and regions. If we want to strengthen welfare and have more resources for welfare, we need to have more companies that can employ, and we need to have more people in employment that can pay tax, because that is how we get money for the welfare system, through employment, through having companies, and that is how we can finance the welfare sector. And we also want to have more generous grants for regions and municipalities.
Jonas Sjöstedt. Madam Speaker, Annie Lööf does not want to take responsibility for the austerity policy that your party pursues, both at national and local level. You've presented an amendment budget. You could have done something, but you didn't. So you are responsible for the budget as it is now. The next step is that you want to remove the tax for the people who earn the most. Above all, men in large cities are the winners. And the bill is sent to the regions and municipalities in Sweden. They increase tax increases that hit against low-income earners because there's no progressiveness in that tax. Municipalities that make drastic reductions in the welfare systems. And there's no shirking away from the fact that the Centre Party is responsible for that today and next year's, and you give priority to tax decreases for rich men in large cities instead of schools, preschools and hospitals.
Well, the Centre Party is actually taking responsibility and will continue doing so the next few years. And that is because we need to, after your left-wing policy. And for example, we have free public transportation for young people during summer breaks. Is that something you want to continue? And how can we help those who do not have enough money to support themselves? In the spring budget that we presented this spring, we did take our responsibility and we added resources for those who need personal assistance, for example, and we want to ensure that we have more people with a job. We want to lower taxes, and we also want to have general grants to municipalities to help not least small municipalities in rural areas, because they cannot apply for those targeted supports that you played with last period in government.
Thank you. The next rejoinder goes to Ebba Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats. You have the floor.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, of the 73 bullet points that forms the basis of the government cooperation, only 2 apply to care for the elderly. And the only thing that is said about staff is that they should have free working clothes. That's good, but we think that's a bit meager. We want to see additional resources to the staff there. These jobs are often very heavy. It's often heavy work, and it's usually women primarily who work there. So we want to make sure that we take measures that we reduce the turnover of staff, that make people feel safer and more secure at the place of work. So I want to ask Annie Lööf, what did you do in your agreement with taking care of the staff in the care for the elderly?
Well, thank you. Many of our proposals have to do with, independent schools. That inquiry should be tossed into the bin. We need to take responsibility, and we wanted to have that freedom of choice for schools, and we also want to work for nurses, assistant nurses, and those who work for the private healthcare sector. They should also be able to have their job also in the future, because what they do is important. We're also going to reduce the targeted state aid. When I listen to other politicians, I do understand that small municipalities cannot apply for those, and that is why we want to have more general support to regions, to municipalities, to allow them to invest in welfare and in healthcare. And we need to help also those rural area municipalities.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Several parts of what Annie Lööf is focused on and mentioned are good points, not least the contribution of the private players involved. We appreciate that. But I hear no proposals for how to improve for the people working in that sector. We know that focused government aid is used for other investments in many cases, so you need to control in very concrete ways. And I'd like to mention the lack of housing for the elderly. By 2026, it's estimated that 32,000 places will be missing. We want to support municipalities who do invest in building new facilities, as opposed to not favouring others who fail to do so. We want to give priority to the municipalities and prioritise benefits over things that are just fun. What are your plans in the Centre Party? Can you mention one reform that you've proposed to deal with the lack of housing?
Well, all those billions that we are going to invest in county councils, in municipalities, with those general support measures. I have listened to all these local politicians who say very clearly that we do not want to have these small targeted subsidies because we can't apply. We will not get any money. So you should have a more general system so that also smaller municipalities can help in strengthening old age care, preschools, schools. So it should not be as targeted as it is today. We should ensure that we have a proper welfare system across the country.
That concludes all rounds of rejoinders. And now for this next address, Jonas Sjöstedt of the Left Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, I might just as well stop sorting my waste. That's Anita Tullbergs that I quote. She has a small house outside the town of Lysekil. not far from a refinery, because she will notice outside her door if Preem are granted their application to expand and double their activities, increasing greenhouse emissions and becoming by far the biggest emitter of the gases which ruin the world's climate. Precisely this shows the dilemma of the government in the area of climate. There's a popular movement, as Per Boland pointed out. People are putting up solar panels on their roofs, they're travelling less by plane, etc. But how are they going to respond if at the same time you allow the Preem oil refinery to double their emissions? Perhaps they will stop sorting their household rubbish. They see that there's no point. The big players can continue to ruin the environment. We believe that this is about the credibility of climate policies in the government. Are they going to expand the capacity of Arlanda Airport in Stockholm by doubling it? It's just not credible. Are they going to build an LNG terminal in Gothenburg and tying us down to fossil fuels? It just doesn't work. Do they intend to invest infrastructure money needed for the railroads and using it instead to a big new motorway in the southern parts of the Stockholm region around Södertörn? Here, in all those areas is where the credibility of the government is determined. Will you keep getting people to opt for solar panels, etc.? Well, to do all that, you need to do the right thing and do what's right in the big and small. I expect an improvement by the government. The climate policies need to stick together from things small to large.
Annie
Lööf from the Centre Party has asked for a rejoinder.
Fru talman,
Madam Speaker, one of the most important tasks of politicians is to give the opportunity for those who were born abroad, especially women, to get into the labour market. We have such a proposal, and today 4 out of 10 entrepreneurs working with domestic services were born abroad, and half of these are women. Jobs used to be under the table type of jobs, and now they're declared properly. Last week we had an inquiry that was started, and they will present proposals on how to make this success even bigger. We'll have more services in this system and will increase the ceiling, which will mean that many more women, many of them born abroad, will have a job. But you want something different. You wanted to force women with the companies to close shop, and you'll make women unemployed. So my question is, what do you have against women having companies working? How come you want to do away with that reform for domestic services deductions that has been so successful?
Tack, fru talman.
Jonas Sjöstedt, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to answer straight away. If you used the corresponding resources to develop elderly services, home services and schools, more secure jobs will be created, and it's a better reform. And it would also be distributed in a more fair way, raising the ceiling for and introducing, as part of the domestic services deduction, alarm companies. This is mostly just investing in wealthy urban areas. That's what we see from some parties right now. But we have proposals that will create more jobs, secure jobs, and a more fair distribution, rather than investing one-sidedly on the investment and consumption of wealthy people.
Fru talman, jag är en
Annie Lööf, well, a socialist will always be a socialist. You want to force private companies to close, and you want to expand the public sector. But the big dividing line is not between high and low income earners, but those who have a job and those who do not. And your left-wing party will mean that more people will be forced to live on subsidies instead of having a job to go to, so that they can contribute to society. We have entrepreneurs who create lots of jobs, and many of these are women who were born abroad, and we want to make it possible for more job opportunities for those who are unemployed today. We want to have more resources for our shared welfare, but you still stick to your old ideology, and you're against these domestic services deductions. What is so provocative in that system? Why do you want to make these women unemployed?
Jonas Sjöstedt. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Annie Lööf is wrong on the facts. When we were involved in the government policies, we saw benefits generally to the public. Now we see that it's mainly in the proposals about reducing taxes for the wealthy. So what do you do in better times and upturning the economy? Do we improve the situation of those who work in preschool? Do we raise funding for the healthcare sector, or do we increase the tax deduction so that those who are already able to pay for cleaning in their homes can get some more? And alarm companies being funded through tax deductions rather than youth clubs for our young people. Annie Lööf is a market liberal as I see it. I'm not. I believe in a redistributing policy which is fairer, helping people all across the country, not just in the wealthiest parts of Sweden.
That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with the next speaker being Ebba Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, all party leaders have spoken, and unfortunately no one else but me has really talked about having this overall approach for the healthcare sector. And I want to get back to what I said initially. This is one of the basic services that society has to provide. When the healthcare system is not working, then that means that we have a big problem with our welfare system, and we do believe that we have the skills, the competences that are necessary within our healthcare system. We do have it. We have those skills, and we do believe that everyone in this chamber means well. And we do not think that we have problems with the healthcare sector because of ill will among politicians, but we have problems with the political leadership, which means that there is an unwillingness today to challenge old patterns. We have problems when it comes to the analysis, when we need to analyze what problems we have. And healthcare has to cost. But what we see today are problems that do not really have to do with money, but with the political decisions. And this has to do with values. Christian Democrats, well, we have values that mean that we can't shy away from dealing with these problems, and that you have to wait for a long time to get care. Well, that is not given by nature, because many countries can manage this. Germany, France, Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, they do not have the same long waiting times. So how come political leaders can accept that other countries do so much better when it comes to these basic services in a welfare system? Madam Speaker, today I want to have a real debate about healthcare. I would like to have it now when we have the next set of rejoinders.
Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, Annie Lööf, the Centre Party, Jonas Sjöstedt, Left Party, and Per Bolund, the Green Party, have asked for rejoinders on the address by Ebba Busch Thor. Stefan Löfven has the floor first. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, we're not going to do a grilling of anyone, but we're going to ask the explanation from the Ebba Busch Thor's party on the abortion right. The investigation was made and a look into how the voting pattern had developed for the vice chairman of your party, the top candidate to the European election. He didn't want to answer questions when this was looked into, and Ebba Busch Thor questioned the independence of the media. And at the same time, she argued that midwives in Sweden could be given the right to refuse to perform an abortion. So I wonder what other working tasks, rules and regulations that Ebba Busch Thor is of the opinion that you can be free to not comply with for religious reasons.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Prime Minister, are you really saying that you haven't heard our reply? we do support the Swedish legislation on abortions. We've done that for 30 years. We have no plans whatsoever on changing it. But we do not think that this is something for the EU. We do not want to negotiate with countries like Poland or Malta, because that would mean doing away with the right to abortion. And we have the Article 9 of the European Convention. We have the Human Rights Convention of the UN, Article 18. And this right that you have to make your own decisions. We have that for journalists as well, for example, that you should not be forced to do something that's against your own personal conviction. We also have that in Swedish collective bargaining agreements, that you can't be forced to do anything against your own conviction. And if these problems arise, it should be solved in the workplace.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, it's no wonder then that this is not very clear for the Christian Democrats. On the one hand, you can say that we support the right to abortion, and then you vote against that approach 22 times in the European Parliament. That's hardly a mistake. 22 times voting against resolutions that condemn situations where a 10-year-old girl who was raped is refused abortion. You're against that in your voting. That's not dignified. It's also strange to say that you want to vote and be of the opinion that midwives can be given the right to not perform abortions, because if the purpose is not to question the right of abortion, or rather another intent, where do you draw the line at the end of the day? Should healthcare staff have the right to refuse vaccinations, blood transfusions? Should police officers be allowed to not act on cases of beating of children? Or should teachers be allowed not to teach on the evolution? Where do you draw the line?
Ebba Busch Thor. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. This makes me really sad to hear a prime minister in a country like Sweden, and you do not know about these declarations on human rights that we are supporting, and to be allowed to follow your own conscience. Well, that is something that is clearly regulated in different conventions. It's not something we came up with. And the Social Democrats, during the electoral campaign, you warned against populism and untruths. But I think that you're becoming part of the problem. At least there is such a suspicion, because here we have the Prime Minister pretending that he doesn't understand that difference as to where decisions are to be made. We have voted for that condemnation of this child in Paraguay not being allowed to have an abortion. I was in favor of that, and the Prime Minister knows.
That concludes this round of rejoinders. Next speaker for a rejoinder is Annie Lööf of the Centre Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, I too would like to talk about the right for women to decide about their own bodies. In the last few weeks, there have been some question marks on the approach by the Christian Democrats on the woman's right to her own body and her own decision. And I'd like to ask Ebba Busch Thor to clarify your approach. In an interview, the vice president of the party, Lars Adaktusson, said in an interview that he wanted to open up for discussion when you come close to a late-stage abortion and where you draw the line. The party would also like to give the midwives the right to refuse to perform an abortion but still keep their jobs, the right to refuse to give care for people working in the healthcare sector. Refusing women care that they are entitled to according to legal provisions is a way of reducing the right of abortion from the kitchen door, so to speak, from the back door. I'd like to discuss with Ebba Busch Thor about the limits of these restrictions and why can people working in the healthcare sector refuse to provide healthcare that is permitted by law.
Ebba Busch Thor. Well, thank you. Well, I don't think that anyone has missed this fact that we have many working in the healthcare sector who are sounding the alarm that abortions happen beyond that span where we do allow it. It used to be week 26, but today we're really happy if someone is premature, born in week 26 and actually survives. And that is why we have those regulations, that it is the profession that decides, so that we have a proper system, so that we not have that overlap between when you can have an abortion and when we can save lives. And that is the basic principle that we want to safeguard, and that this is a principle that we stand behind. We do not want to change our opinion. We have supported the right of abortion for 30 years. It's crystal clear.
I love, Madam Speaker. Ebba Busch Thor explained the outline and the design of the Swedish legislation. The rules will shift in terms of the number of weeks when there is medical progress. This is why it's so strange with the discussion from the Christian Democrats and Lars Adaktusson's comments and Ebba Busch Thor's articles. And the purpose of having such a discussion when we have a Swedish legislation which is designed in a particular way. But freedom of conscience, you are entitled when you work in healthcare that you're permitted in many European countries to refuse to provide care. In Italy, for example, 70% of gynecologists refuse to perform an abortion. And that right is a restriction on the right of a woman to access an abortion. And this is provided for by law. The woman is not met with dignity, and there is a real danger that they will find themselves in an even more difficult situation while they're already in a difficult position meeting their midwife to discuss an abortion. So how do you support Swedish abortion legislation while at the same time canvassing for the right of midwives not to perform abortions?
Tack.
Ebba Busch Thor, well, thank you. I do think that you understood my reply and first question. And then let me say again that we have no proposals on changing legislation in Sweden, but this with freedom of conscience, we have solved that for journalists, and we need to do the same thing here. It has to be solved in the workplace, but we are not going to participate in a development where women who want to end their pregnancies, that they will be shamed for doing that. We've had enough of that in Sweden. We have had women who've been shamed because they want to go through with their pregnancy in spite of having a difficult financial, social situation, and also the opposite, that women have been shamed because they do not want to go through with a pregnancy. But we want to continue to help women, but we're not saying that we do not want freedom when it comes to journalists. We should stick to what we have in collective bargaining agreements, also for midwives.
And the next rejoinder is for Jonas Sjöstedt.
Tack, fru talman. Ebba Busch Thor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Ebba Busch Thor. The international movement that exists that wants to restrict women's rights to decide about their own bodies and to reduce the right to abortion. It's changed their strategy in recent years. Today, it's the right to refuse care, or what we call the conscience principle, so that midwives should not have to perform abortions in accordance with the law. That's the new tactics. This is the Christian Democrats' motion from last year, that it should be possible to refuse to provide care in Sweden. They're not straightforward enough to say that we want a parliamentary decision. They give this consideration to the regions. They should decide, but it's a matter of the right to free abortion. And I just have a very straightforward question for you. Do you think, Ebba Busch Thor, that Swedish midwives should have the right to refuse to perform abortions?
I don't think we're dealing with this matter in the dignified way it should be dealt with. Jonas Sjöstedt knows that we support the Swedish right to an abortion. He also knows that there's no other situation except one where it's up to the woman herself to decide whether she wants to abort or not in any given context. That is the only way to design the system. You are talking about this as if it was a proposal from the Christian Democrats. So here's my question back to respond to the rather naive question I was just asked. Does the Left Party no longer support the Article 18 of the UN Convention on the on human rights, on the freedom of conscience, or no longer the European Convention Article 9?
Partiet, varsågod.
Thank you, Jonas Sjöstedt, the Left Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I asked a very straightforward question, which is at the very core of what we're discussing. My question was, should Swedish health care staff be able to refuse to perform abortions? Because that could be a step on the way to restricting the right to abortion in Sweden. Ebba Busch Thor does not want to answer that question, but I think you owe the electorate to answer that question. Yes, the Christian Democrats want Swedish midwives to have the right to refuse this, or no, the right to abortion should not be restricted in this way. I think the very lack of an answer is a problem, because you are trying to say two things at the same time. You want to pursue a policy that involves restricting the right to abortion, but you don't want to stand up for that policy. My answer is abundantly clear. I have no desire to restrict the right to abortion in Sweden. We follow the law.
Thank you. And my reply is the same. I'm not prepared to limit or restrict the right to abortion in any way in Sweden. I support the current legislation. I'm going to do everything in my power to ensure that it's upheld. Crystal clear. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders. And the next rejoinder is Per Bolund of the Green Party.
Ja, tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I often try to think positively and see good things. Sometimes it's difficult to find any, but I've found one good thing about the moderate Christian Democrat and Sweden Democrat budget, and it was that it was very clear to the voters what very strong distinction lines there are in Swedish politics. It used to apply to environmental policy, and what was done then was to reduce many aspects of what the United Nations, for example, say has been the best climate policy in the world. The Christian Democrats seem to think that that's how you save money. But we have managed to change this. The airplane tax will still be there. The support for the countryside will still be there. But we now have a major climate debate in society. So I'm asking you, Ebba Busch Thor, would you once again vote for a budget that is financed through reduced investments in the climate?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Of course, I would once again vote in favour of investments to reduce emissions, not just priding ourselves of saying how much money we are at in different components. And the fact of the matter is that even though we removed several of the goodie bags that looked so nice, but which had such little impact on the reducing emissions, so that under the years of the Red-Green Party we've now seen an increase in our emissions. In spite of getting rid of some of these goodie bags, we still made the second largest budget investment in the areas of climate and the environment in the history of this country, investing in environmentally related research, water cleaning, improving the situation for the seas and oceans. There were a number of areas where we made improvements. We want to make a difference, not just pay lip service. These are the differences between our two parties.
Thank you, Per Bolund. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think the electorate is wise enough to see whether we're talking about a cut or not. And if you compare the budget options, it's very obvious that there's less money for climate and environmental investments in the budget voted through by the moderates, the Christian Democrats and the Sweden Democrats. I don't think we should try and cover up what you're trying to do. You can speak about efficiency as much as you like, but your budget was not a budget that resulted in greater efficiency and effectiveness. It just gave us less environmental policy, and you have to be honest and tell the voters that. This is a budget that will lead to increased emissions. We know that the investments we make will lead to less emissions, that we are converting Sweden to be a fossil-free society. So, of course, less money in the budget for that will lead to more emissions. I'm happy that we have managed to correct some of the mistakes made by your party's budget, but still.
Fru talman.
Ebba Busch Thor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Per Bolund needs to choose his words carefully. It was the budget of the Christian Democrats and the Moderates with support from the Sweden Democrats, but we didn't table it jointly. And let me make a parallel to the area of healthcare. Nobody else seems to be interested in thinking about the 83,000 patients who are still waiting after the legal waiting time requirements has expired. Jörn Hägglund had 1 billion for reducing waiting times in one go. Now there's a lack of money again, and you've managed to double the waiting times in the healthcare. And we know that it's going to get even worse this summer. And the same thing goes for the environment and the climate. You need to do the right things, take the right measures. And you've been criticised over and over again from the Institute on the Economic Financial Conjunctures, Conjuncture Institute and other areas. I want us to reduce the emissions for real. Symbolic measures will not work. We need proper reform.
That was the end of all the rejoinders, and the next speaker is Jan Björklund from the Liberal Party. You have the floor.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, in my last speech from this rostrum as a party leader, I'd like to turn to my party leader colleagues, and I'd like to thank you for the cooperation that we have and that we've had. There's a lot to the word cooperation. When we discuss with each other, it doesn't look like cooperation, but it is a form of cooperation all the same. On many occasions, we met TV viewers and others who said, can you have a normal relationship with the other party leaders? And because you're always arguing. But of course, we have a relationship as colleagues. We can ask each other what the weekend was like, and we meet in many different contexts. And when important decisions are to be taken, we talk informally to each other. And those contacts are very valuable in many contexts because the debates are more relaxed than they would otherwise have been. But it's also the case that in situations when the Swedish government and the Swedish parliament has to make difficult decisions, then there is trust and confidence between us. So I'd like to thank you. It will take a while before the rest of you will have had 39 party leader debates. You can calculate the numbers yourself. But thanks so much to you. And I would also like to say to the predecessors as well, thank you so much for the cooperation we've had in this group of party leaders.
Thank you. And to this address, the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, Ulf Kristersson, Jimmy Åkesson, Annie Lööf, Jonas Sjöstedt, Ebba Busch Thor and Per Bolund have asked for a rejoinder. The Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, first of all.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would, of course, now, on the occasion of Jan Björklund's final party leaders debate, express a warm debt of gratitude to you. I can confirm everything you said and confirm that it's important for the general public to know that there is cooperation in this chamber. We haven't always agreed in our debates and in the rounds of rejoinders. There have been harsh words spoken, but Jan Björklund has often made me smile. And I think more so than any other colleague, there have been snails and aliens from outer space and various other points. And I think we're in danger of having more boring debates when Jan Björklund leaves the chamber. But there's a lot more to this as well, of course. Jan Björklund has a real political involvement. He's always had the courage to stand up for his own opinions and that of the Liberals, even when it's been uncomfortable. He has real involvement, not least for Swedish schools, combating honor-related oppression and your historic past. Now you have more time to spend with your beloved family and for the armed forces, I believe. And in order for this to be made possible, and facilitated, I'd like to give to you a wilderness pack to support you on all those occasions where we hope that you will have nice weather and sunshine, of course, but it does rain almost from underneath, where you have to start a fire with wet timber or wet wood logs, and that might make you think about these wonderful moments. We'd like to make life a little bit easier for you in those moments, Jan Björklund, with a small token of appreciation. Thank you, Jan Björklund.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Stefan Löfven. Let me say that I have greatly appreciated the cooperation with Stefan Löfven. There's been different phases to this. I think the first time we met was when we had a campaign 20 years ago to say yes to the euro. And then when it comes to energy policy, when you were the chair, when you, Stefan Löfven, was the chairman of the Metal Workers Union. But I also remember the occasion when the Independent Schools Committee was one of the most dramatic inquiries that we appointed in Sweden, because there were drastic ideological splits between us. So we appointed an inquiry to see if we could get somewhere. And Stefan Löfven and I met in a room and found the necessary solutions to ensure a broad unity. There's been more debate after that, but we found a solution at the time. This is a sign both of the fact that when it's necessary, you take the conflict, but you also cooperate when that's needed. The January agreement has obviously been a strain on my party. We've been open about that, and I also know that it's been a strain on your party because the contents have not been pleasant to everyone. It's been better for my party than for yours, but still, thank you for the cooperation.
Ulf Kristersson of the Moderate Party.
Jag trodde statsministern hade lovat.
I thought the Prime Minister would promise you more money for the armed forces, seeing you're going to military service this summer. But nevertheless, both of our parties have often shared common opinions and views. We haven't always agreed, however, either in government or on the matter of which government is right for this country. But I like you as a person. I truly do. You're a quick thinker, you're funny, and you are serious. You are yourself. You are who you are, fully and entirely. More people should do like you. You have one character trait that is very important, that it would be valuable to more people. You can have one opinion politically and not let this affect your assessment of an individual. You can separate those two. That's a unique and very valuable property in any individual. I and many others have appreciated this. I have 3 books for you when you transition to your new life. Bodil Jönsson's most recent, Gott om tid, a lot of time available. Patrik Hadenius, Pause, the Art of Doing Something Else. And when the spirit of constructing and building society hits you, I have Lena Andersson's wonderful story, Son of Svea, on the topic of the home for all Swedes. Thank you so much for all your work over the years.
Jan Björklund, Liberalerna, varsågod.
Jan Björklund. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank Ulf Kristersson. It's possibly the case that there are a few years between us. I'm not sure. But still, we have been in the youth organizations in roughly the same time. We've been in municipal politics at about the same time. We were elected to parliament at more or less the same time, and we've been party leaders. And I've always appreciated the cooperation with you, Ulf Kristersson. You're both ideological, but you're also practical, not least when there was a lot of ruckus about the social insurance systems. It was a great comfort to have you there as the Minister for Social Insurance. So thank you so much for the cooperation over the years. Thank you. The floor now goes to Jimmie Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, in interviews I'm often told that I am the party leader who's served the longest, and that's actually true. I have. But I'm not the one who's served the longest in the Swedish Parliament. I had a 5-year stint when I was not an MP, and the 39 party leaders debates is not something I've attained yet, but I may get that far, and I promise to get in touch with Jan Björklund the day I can beat that, what I suppose is a record. I'm not sure. We haven't really cooperated very much, myself and Jan Björklund. I think that would be incorrect to say. But we did take the arguments against each other in the EU elections, for example. We visited a number of places in Sweden together to discuss the European Union. And what struck me then, and really something I've been aware of throughout his term as a party leader, he really has a true ideological conviction. He's not a populist, Jan Björklund, and I appreciate that. And I've appreciated our debates, and they've been at that level. And I think anyone who's watched those debates appreciated it similarly. Nor, Madam Speaker, would I say that Jan Björklund has been one of my role models. However, towards the end, I felt that I saw some inspiration for myself in terms of my attire from Jan Björklund. His dress sense, he spent at least 2 election campaigns to wear the same same shirt, we said, and then he sold it and came back with the same shirt again. I don't know if it was the same shirt again. I see that he's not wearing that particular shirt today, so perhaps he sold it again like he did with the previous one. But if that is the case, I thought that the short problem period that I had when I tried to copy his style ends now because I brought him a new shirt. And I know that you can get away with this much better than I will. I've signed it with today's date, in fact, and I'm going to send it along with you when you leave.
Jan Björklund, Liberal.
Thank you, Jan Björklund. Madam Speaker, thank you so much, Jimmy Åkesson. Well, as you said, the entry of the Sweden Democrats was handled in a rather complicated manner by the parties initially, and all the parties have had to consider how to handle this relationship. At the beginning, we didn't even want to debate with you, and I reacted against that. And I was criticized when I now invited Jimmy Åkesson to debates during the European election campaign. As Jimmy Åkesson himself said, we don't cooperate about the politics, but we should cooperate by debating politics. And I greatly appreciate the debates that we had here. It was a factual, ideologically based debate. And it also makes it easier to debate when you have 2 completely different viewpoints, because you don't have to make up the differences, they are already there. I must admit that the success of the Sweden Democrats is due to politics and the political wins, but I also believe that they are due to the personal properties of Jimmy Åkesson as the party leader.
Annie Lööf, Centerpartiet.
Thank you. And Annie Lööf, Center Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, today we have, the cheapest defense ever. This is something that Edmund Burke used to say. And I have to say that Jan has really tried to ensure that we have a strong Swedish defense. During the 12 years as a party leader, the old Folkpartiet and now the Liberal Party, you have really made an impression in Swedish politics. And also as a colleague, we have laughed together, we have also discussed with each other, and we have spent many early mornings and late nights together. And I have danced with Jan Björklund, and we have also had different opinions, but we have always shared that respect for liberal values. We have always fought for liberal values, and we have always tried to highlight liberalism in Swedish policies. And we have also fought together against xenophobia and racism, and you have really stood tall during that fight. And now I leave. Jan leaves Swedish politics, and we will remember his humor, his timing, and everything he has done for Swedish politics. And he's now becoming a political veteran, and that is why we have given a gift to Swedish veterans and their association. But in addition to that, I would also like to extend your wardrobe something. I do believe that your blue campaign shirts can now be put in the closet forever, because now you will stand on the sidelines and you will watch instead of having to roll up your sleeves. And that is why we want to give you a new piece of attire as well. And thank you for all your hard work.
Jan Björklund.
Thank you, Jan Björklund. Madam Speaker, thank you, Annie Lööf. Well, we have cooperated a lot with everyone here, but maybe you and I the most. We were ministers during the same period from 2011 for 3 years, and we've been party leaders in opposition, and not least we've cooperated during the past year, which has been very turbulent, where we took the same position on the basis of our liberal convictions, how we are going to navigate through this modern society, and everyone else was angry with us. I greatly appreciate Annie Lööf as a person and the cooperation we've had. And in some ways, I have to say that I'm impressed by Annie Lööf's capacity and ability to cope. It was very, very difficult for you at the beginning. It's going very well now, but in the beginning it was difficult, and people said you're too young. But you stood up to the challenge and you persevered, and I think that's very, very good.
And we will continue with Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Jan Björklund, I want to say thank you to you for everything you had done in Swedish politics. We do not always share the same opinion, but I know that you have done a lot for Swedish politics. And thank you for all these debates that have been great fun. You give, you take, but you always keep your sense of humor, and you always have a good answer, even if debates get tough and difficult. And I will miss you. I'll miss you here in the chamber in these debates, even if we usually disagree. I will look towards your old seat, and I will think that, oh, but Jan Björklund should be sitting there tweeting about schools, but you will not be there, and we will not have your humor in these debates. And if we discuss free trade agreements, for example, you will not be here to talk about the fact that you like both free and trade. I'll miss you. And you'll now start a new part of your life, and I hope that you will get what is wanting in the party leader life, that you'll have time for your family, to do what you want, to wake up a morning not knowing what you're to do with that day. I think that this is something that you've earned. You should now be given time for your interests. And something that steals time for us, well, that is the cell phones with tweets and phone calls, etc. And that is often what keeps us away from our families. There are those who feel that you need to legislate about cell phones. I'm not going to mention any names, but there are those. But there is another solution to move away from your cell phone. I have 2 kids that go to school, and I actually have my son Tor, who has done this during crafts class. It's a mobile cell phone box. So this is where you put your cell phone when you do not want to have any disturbances. So when you come home to your family, you take your cell phone, you put it here, and you close the lid. And then you can forget about that pressure, that stress, and just spend time with your kids and your wife. You've earned it. You deserve it.
Thank you. Madam Speaker. Thank you, Jonas Sjöstedt. I'm deeply moved. I've received great presents, but the fact that your kids have made this, well, I think Jonas Sjöstedt and I have met in more debates than with anyone else. We all meet in the chamber a lot, but we've met on the campaign trail, on television, etc., because we're on opposite sides. But I must say I've appreciated our debates more than any other because they're clear. And as I said to Jimmy Åkesson, when you are ideologically completely different, then the demarcation lines become completely clear. And I will certainly miss our debates because that's the way I've looked at it.
And then Eva Busch Thor, Christian Democrats.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, I've appreciated Jan Björklund's efforts to work for Swedish schools, and he has done so much. He's turned this big tanker around. What the Swedish school used to be. He's turned it around. He's also done a lot for our defense debate, and he's made the rest of us to collaborate to ensure that we would get somewhere. And that wouldn't have been possible without him. He's done that in government, in parliament, and also in the local city council of Stockholm. And we do not end our terms as party leaders together. But even if we do not do that, I want to say that I've really appreciated you. You're a wise, sensible, warm colleague, opponent, fellow citizen. You, Jan, and I, we have had difficult, tough discussions, not least when we were in the alliance together. But these are also the debates and the discussions that I really value and have cherished the most. I'll miss you. And, well, I would also like to present a gift. Maybe we'll have something that's a bit more serious on Monday, but there is a bit of humor in this gift, and I think at least Jan Björklund will see that humor. It's a symbol, a reminder about the Swedish school where we did not work enough with the writing classes, for example. And this is a reminder. And thank you.
Jan Björklund, Liberalerna, varsågod.
Jan Björklund, you have the floor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you so much, Ebba Busch Thor, for the time that we have cooperated. I appreciate the political style of Ebba Busch Thor. It's very straightforward, not just in public, but also when we are in smaller circles. No one misunderstands you. You're always crystal clear. And I think that's a part of the success of the Christian Democrat. And just as I said to Anna Lööf, let me say that I'm greatly impressed by the perseverance that you showed during the difficult years at the beginning. You started out young and you hear all sorts of opinions. She's too young, she's inexperienced, but you've really shown what things should be like. So thank you so much and best of luck for the future. Thank you. The last speaker is Per Bolund from the Green Party.
Ja, tack fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've happened to be in the same building as Jan Björklund, but never at the same time. You were in the city council in Stockholm, and then I came there, but then you moved, and the same thing with government, so that we're here in the same capacity and at the same time. Well, that's a great opportunity for me to address you. I also appreciate your courage that you've shown throughout your career and in the debates. And when things get difficult in Sweden and when we really need to collaborate to continue, then Jan Björklund has also shown a lot of courage, and he has shown us how to take those steps that were necessary, and I and many with me have appreciated that. Well, our parties have different positions in many questions, energy not the least, but there are other things that I appreciate with Jan Björklund, the feeling for social liberalism and the sense for the importance of freedom. I feel this as well. But I would also like to talk about biological diversity in oceans and on land, and the environmental movement has also noted that this is something that the Liberal Party has addressed as well. And now, when you'll have some more time, I was thinking that perhaps you should do something more practical, and perhaps you can ensure that you have grass with wild plants growing to help insects, and also a little house to help you help the birds in Sweden. And we all want to see who will move into this little bird house. But big thank you. Thank you for everything you've done. It's been a pleasure to see what you have been doing in Swedish politics.
Jan Björklund, Liberal.
Thank you, Jan Björklund, the Liberals. You have the floor. Madam Speaker, thank you so much, Per Bolund. We haven't had the opportunity to cooperate in our roles as party leaders for a very long time, but we have cooperated before, not least in the Stockholm City Hall. And I've always appreciated you, Per Bolund, because you have a stronger strain than most of being very ambitious when it comes to really amassing knowledge about what you're doing. And I think this was obvious from the first party leader debate here. There was less of the superficial phrases, but you were always factual, and your environmental dedication and commitment has always been there for as long as I've known you. That's your real passion. But I primarily have appreciated your focus on knowledge and factual correctness.
Avslutade.
Thank you. That concludes all the sets of rejoinders. And on behalf of the speakers, I also want to address Jan Björklund and say thank you. Thank you for your time as a party leader, for all your commitment, all your involvement during these debates, and a big good luck in the future with all these nice gifts that you have been given. I hope you understand that we all appreciate you. Thank you. And that concludes the we then have Per Bolund from the Environmental Party.
Ja, tack fru talman. Det känns ju som att...
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It feels like coming up here after the grand finale, after we've thanked Jan Björklund. But I think Jan Björklund, in his speech, also broadened the perspectives, which is often needed in the debates. I'd like to raise the perspective a bit too and discuss what objectives we are striving for in society. What do we want to achieve together, and specifically link this to consumption in our society? Because we consume more than ever in Sweden, but the question we have to ask is, does that make us feel better than ever? The need for storage is increasing all the time. We keep getting more and more things. And this is information I get from the storage industry, which is one of the fastest growing industries in Sweden. But if consumption and increased consumption automatically made us happy, then we would be the happiest people in the world. But at the same time, as we consume more, mental ill health is increasing in our society, among children specifically, and more people suffer from burnout syndrome. So we have to start talking seriously about this consumption policy. We need to create an economy that manages to take the long-term view further than the nearest consumption opportunity. When we reduced the VAT on repairs and we introduced the repairs tax deduction and the new types of economic measures will increase the desirability of using second-hand and rented stuff. We have the Hyber deduction that will come in January. We need to choose a different kind of society, and the time has come to do that now.
And rejoinders have been requested by Annie Lööf, Centre Party, Jonas Sjöstedt, and Left, Ebba Busch Thor, Christian Democrats. We'll begin with Annie Lööf.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, about a year ago, Swedish television talked about a loan guarantee from the Swedish Export Council, that how that will be granted for building a fossil plant in Russian Arctic. And this is something that will emit gigantic amounts of emissions every year. And the indigenous population has already noted the impact on the environment and fishing. We also have the Paris Agreement, but the government has not updated the guidelines for this government agency, so they can continue to give exporter credits to facilities like this one, working with natural gas. Will you do anything to stop that? Or are you happy with the fact that the Swedish government is actually financing natural gas in the Arctic?
Well, the answer, Madam Speaker, to the last question is no. We don't want to have more fossil exploration. We know from research that we mustn't use all those resources in fossil oil and gas, etc. We need to refocus instead for sustainable solutions, and we're putting all our efforts into a climate law, refocusing the resources of the financial markets in favor of climate, and that has to go for government investments as well. And now that we're putting together a new export strategy, we're saying very clearly that we want sustainability as a focus. We want to support all those companies in Sweden who are focused on developing sustainable solutions, allowing them to export them to the rest of the world, because we know that market is very extensive globally. We can lead the way, develop the technological solutions, and export it to the rest of the world so that we can make the biggest contribution to a sustainable world for the future. That's our approach.
Thank you, Annie Lööf. Well, Madam Speaker, 4 years ago, the Paris Agreement was signed, and we have also been working on an export strategy and been active in Sweden. But the Green Party has done nothing. The Export Credits Agency has given money for the Arctic, which will mean that 5 million tons of carbon dioxide will be released into the atmosphere every year, and this will have a negative impact on the climate and the indigenous population. And this is a scandal that your party has not acted over these years, and the responsibility for what the government agencies are doing lies with government. And now, of course, it's good that you start to deal with this and the guidelines, but that is after this was talked about in Swedish television, and the gas plant is there where it is. Will you stop this loan guarantee for extracting gas from the Arctic?
Fru talman, vi har...
Per Bodlund, final rejoinder. Thank you. As opposed to Annie Lööf, we've taken the measures required to build the future sustainable society. We've worked very structurally. When we came to government offices, there was nothing in the drawers. We had to fill climate and environmental policies with new content. We have the Climate Act, we have the shift of fuels with more renewables, in the new system, which is now which now means a major increase in the sale of electrified cars, for example. But we want sustainability to be the focus of a new revamped export strategy, for example. It's not reasonable to say that the export credit is what ensured this entirely. There's a small component which is also moving in the wrong direction as far as we're concerned, but we need to devise the rules and provisions right now in such a way that we can have sustainable export focus in the future. Exporting environmental and green technology, that's a matter of survival for the industry.
Thank you. And that concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with Jonas Sjöstedt.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Per Bolund. The government is now facing many important decisions about climate policy, infrastructure, Arlanda, the LNG terminal in Gothenburg, and not the least, the very extensive plans on expanding the refinery in Lysekil on the west coast. And if this is done, we'll have 3.4 million tons, a doubling of what we have today of emissions, and that will be a big part of the Swedish emissions. And I now have a question for you, not in your capacity of being part of government. I want to ask what the Green Party thinks, and are you against expanding that refinery?
Thank you, Per Bolund. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Green Party approach is simple and clear. We want investments to be made to construct whatever is sustainable for the future. We don't see fossil investment as a part of a sustainable future. So if we want to reach our climate objectives, we need to refocus our investments to sustainable ones. At the same time, it's important to be aware of the fact that we're in a society which is far from sustainable at this stage. We haven't yet constructed the sustainable society, so some investments will remain, which do not bring us clearly in the right path. But as quickly as possible, we want to refocus all resources to having a sustainable energy supply. So we've acted at EU level by raising the cost of emission rights in the trading system 5 times. We've also included in the January agreement that we want to review all relevant legislation so that it gets in line with the Climate Act and help us to reach the objectives of the Climate Act. So you can trust the Green Party to always be a force, whether we're in opposition or in government, to refocus investments to sustainable energy modes.
Jonas Sjöstedt. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Per Bolund is not really saying it, but his line of reasoning will mean, or that he claims, that, well, they're opposed to financing these emissions, and the Green Party could act. The Climate Act is not strong enough, that's obvious. And the government could actually do something, because the government could use its right, its prerogative to stop this planned expansion. And this is about the plausibility of the government climate policy. If we do not stop the big sinners, well, then ordinary people will feel that there's no point. So my question is, the Green Party, Per Bolund, are you prepared to act in government and try to stop these emissions?
Per Bolund of the Green Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Jonas Sjöstedt raises a matter which is a little bit early, because this is before the courts, and they're dealing with it right now. And the court will announce its ruling, and neither one of us can preempt that. We'll have to wait and see how they interpret the current legislation, where real consideration is to be made of the climate. That's part of the provisions. What we're doing actively right now, however, is that we work to agree with different parties so that we can take action and review the legislation which impacts, for example, environmental and climate-related investments, so that legislation can produce a situation where we can reach the objectives of the Climate Act. And that is the single most important point. The more rapidly we can proceed in that direction, the better. And we can refocus investments and shift to a welfare society which is not fossil-based. That is our objective, and that's something we need to do in a very ambitious manner.
And thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we'll continue with Ebba Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats.
Tack.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I read an article last fall where the New York Times tried to explain why green Germany is still dependent on coal, and that was well worth reading. New York Times talked about how there is no grid to send electricity from wind farms to the industries in the other end of the country. And Der Spiegel has also written about this, talking about the transition, that it has costed a lot of money, billions of krona, but that there is an opposition against this transformation to something that's more environmental friendly. And I do think there are several parallels to the policy that you're trying to conduct, where you want to make it more difficult to have district heating and more difficult to really supply energy for everyone. And do you come to any conclusions about this, looking at what has happened with Germany and their problems?
Tack, fru talman. Ibland så märker...
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You notice sometimes that you interpret and understand reality in very different ways, completely different ways, in fact, and the way you perceive development as well. On the contrary, we see that so much is moving in the right direction in Germany. They've significantly improved and increased investments in renewable energy. They've passed out coal. We see this in Sweden, where we're doubling wind power in the next few years. We'll see a similar development. I had expected that the climate debate would have a bit of an impact in Swedish politics, and that it would make you think about your old views. But when I've looked at millions of young people out demonstrating for the climate across the globe, I hadn't expected that the reaction in politics would be that when we raise the cost of emissions so that we can get rid of carbon, would turn the Christian Democrats into the biggest supporters of coal. That was unexpected to me. Why do you think it's better? Why do you not think it's better to use biofuels than to safeguard coal?
Well, I want to ensure that we have no coal whatsoever that's being used in Sweden, and I don't want us to end up in a situation where we have to import dirty coal energy from Germany, for example, or becoming dependent on Russian gas. But if we are to manage this, we need more energy. And short-term thinking, what we see today is that some cities are forced to say no, they can't build new environmental friendly apartments because of a lack of energy. And the same thing, industry cannot switch to energy friendly protection. And if you have an electric car, there is nowhere to charge it. In Uppsala, we have seen that they have had to say no to server halls and factories because there is not enough energy capacity. And in Malmö, the bakery Pågen cannot expand its bakery, its factory. And we need to see that there are problems with the short-term thinking that we see today, where we say no to nuclear.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The short-termedness is definitely a term that hits both ways. It's a short-term approach to not take action against climate change and to fail to understand the extent to it we're affected by climate change in Sweden and in the world. And to not do everything to get rid of coal in Sweden is rather embarrassing. That we still have coal-based power production in Sweden. It's high time to dismantle it and use the available alternative bio, CHP, new types of fuels, and solar cells, not least, which have come up on Swedish roofs. But unfortunately, in the budget from the Christian Democrats and the moderates, there's a reduction by 50% in the support for these panels. It's about a choice. We want renewable energy, 100% renewables in the new energy system. We need to invest along those lines if that's what we want. And we need to make sure that coal will pay the full cost of their pollution. That the Christian Democrats are against this is something I regret vividly.
And that was the last set of rejoinders. I want to say thank you to all the party leaders for this debate, and that concludes the party leader debate. And that means that the interpretation will stop here as well.
Övergår vi till att debattera socialförsäkringsutskottets betänkande. Förlåt? Då tar vi punkt 2, anmälan om återkallelse av proposition. Genom skrivelse 2018/19:149 har regeringen återkallat proposition 2017/18:258, avtal om politisk dialog och samarbete mellan Europeiska unionen och dess medlemsstater å ena sidan och republiken Kuba å andra sidan. Skrivelsen läggs till handlingarna. Punkt 3. Anmälan om granskningsrapport. Jag anmäler att en granskningsrapport från Riksrevisionen har inkommit och överlämnats till utskott